Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tom Donohue, President and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Chamber for this very important event. Many of you have not been here before, and so later on when they turn off all the spotlights and everything, you want to take a look at the ceiling here and at the flags. We call this the Hall of Flags, and those flags are the flags of the great adventurers and discoverers like Christopher Columbus. This building and this room was finished sometime around 1923. So while you see some of the states that are listed up there, you'll find some that aren't listed up there because they weren't states at that time. So just get a look at it before you go home. By the way, what I do is I'm the President and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And on behalf of the Chamber and our foundation, I'm very, very pleased to welcome you here. And I want to thank the NAACP and its President and CEO, Cornell Brooks, for partnering with us on this event. He and I have become we've had more short meetings. We had a couple of long ones, but we sort of sit down, get our heads together, and we're going a mile a minute on all kinds of stuff, and I don't know what kind of trouble we're getting in, but it sounds good to me. What brings us together today is a civil rights issue, an economic issue, and at its core, an issue of American opportunity. Education is key to opportunity in this country for all of our children and many of our adults. We have many fine schools staffed with mostly dedicated and hardworking teachers. But no one can deny that from school to school, from district to district, from state to state, the quality of education differs vastly. Our education system is a patchwork that is propelling some to success and consigning others to failure. For those who slip through the cracks, their reach is limited, their potential is stifled, and their chances of living a good life, is not very positive, but a life of struggle greatly increases. This is a fundamental driver of inequity in our country. It's unfair, it's unjust, and it's at odds with the American promise of equal opportunity for all. Now, let me be clear. We can never guarantee equal outcome, nor should we want to. Even with uniformity in good education, outcomes will vary. Each of us is endowed with individual gifts and talents that will take us down different paths and allow us to achieve various different levels of success. But everyone should get a fair shot at living up to their own potential and defining success for themselves. And the reality is we'll never have equal opportunity for all without quality education for all. The for all part is where we are really dropping the ball today. As we'll discuss over the course of this conference, this problem is particularly acute in the African American community and with other minority groups. It's not to say that we don't have some of the same problems in other schools and other school districts, but in this instance, it is more acute with our minority groups. Over the next 2 days, we're going to explore these challenges, consider some reforms our system needs, and to discuss how all of the stakeholders, especially businesses and civil leaders at the local level, can help lead the charge for change. To help guide this discussion, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation is releasing 2 new studies this week. One focuses on academic achievement among African American students. The study reveals that even though their academic performance has improved over the past 25 years, especially by key indicators like high school graduation, the system is still badly failing many African American students. Today, only 18% of African Americans, fourth graders that is, and 16% of eighth graders are proficient in reading. The number is not very much, but a little bit better in math. Only 1 in 10 African Americans who graduate from high school is actually college ready in all 4 fundamental subjects of English, math, reading, and science. And we're seeing the grim effect of these educational shortcomings in the 20% unemployment rate for young African Americans. The numbers can be discouraging, but the report also spotlights several company, state, and community-based programs that are addressing the achievement gap for low-income and minority students. And we'll hear during this meeting specific examples of what's working and discuss some best practices to follow, and we'll do so in the first panel discussion. The second study highlights 2 states and the District of Columbia, whose educational systems were once lagging far behind nationally and are now making big strides forward. The educational improvements underway in Washington, D.C. are especially instructive. Nearly 75% of its students are African Americans. Just 10 years ago, D.C. was one of the most dysfunctional school systems in the country. Some called it a national disgrace. But it has made some radical changes, a major shakeup in its governance, tough-minded reforms including rigorous standards and strong accountability, and the creation of vibrant charter schools. Now, anyone who has watched the process unfold knows that it hasn't been a walk in the park, and the work is still far from done. But D.C. schools are striving to achieve results. Over the past 10 years, D.C. students have improved faster than those of any other state or national academic performance test. The achievement gap can be closed for all of our students, and we should take a close look at what's working here so we can carry it other places. As these studies show, the most effective reforms will be led at the state and local level, but the federal government has a role to play. Just within the last few days, it almost seems like the last few hours, Congress has finally stepped up and passed legislation to revamp the nation's largest K-12 education program. The final bill was not perfect. Underline that. The final bill was not perfect. It could have gone further on accountability, but it represents the spirit of compromise necessary to tackle a major challenge like educational reform in a fascinating place like the Congress of the United States. The bill strengthens our nation's commitment to ensuring that all students have access to a quality education. And it balances the interests of those who rely on a well-educated workforce and believe in real accountability with those who want less federal control and more state and local flexibility. Okay? 2 strong interests. We're in a lot better place than we were 2 weeks ago. Now, with that flexibility comes a lot of responsibility. The law will only be effective if we work with the states, and we've talked about this, work with the states to create strong accountability systems focused on academic achievement for all students. If we see exceptions and expectations being watered down, if the importance of academic performance is diminished, or if we delay what we have committed to doing for struggling students, everyone in this room has to call it out, and we have to call it out not generally, because so many people will be doing it well, but specifically. People don't like to do that, you know, but of course I'm an Irishman willing to do something like that all the time. You look what I said last night about the Republican primary process, and it's all over the newspapers today. I think you probably agree with me. Now, we've got laws, we have ideas, and we have local examples to help us improve education for all of our students. What we need now, and if you don't take anything else out of what I say here, is what we need now is the leadership to drive this program forward. The Chamber and the NAACP and our partners at the state and local levels can provide that leadership. We are, after all, the key stakeholders. For the business community's part, we need more qualified workers in our workforce. If more of our schools can turn out young adults who are well educated and have the right skills, believe me, we will hire them. The ones we won't hire immediately, the ones that go on to college and go on to other education. The bottom line, we need human talent in the business community more than we need anything else. For the NAACP, our natural partner here, like the Chamber, it has national clout, a nationwide reach, and a rich history. It is the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the country, and it has been on the forefront of efforts to make education more accessible, more diverse, and more equal. Imagine what we could accomplish if we had the courage, seems like we do, to work together towards a common goal here. And we hope it's not just the two of us, but that everybody here will join us. As respective businesses and civic leaders, you, the people in this room, and the people like you all over the country can lead this charge. You can be the agents of change. You can be the boots on the ground, to quote a lot of what we're hearing about what's going on around the world, but you get the picture. You can be the leaders in our capitals and our communities, and the voices in the ears of state lawmakers and school administrators. You can help bring together local stakeholders and bridge differences like we have done in the Congress. This issue is too important to let disagreements about other issues divert progress. This challenge calls for compromise and collaboration, and that's the spirit of this partnership that we have begun. Above all, let's never forget what really is at stake here. It's the hope of a bright future for any young person, no matter where she lives or what her background happens to be. It is the stability and the prosperity of entire communities. It is the strength of our workforce and the competitiveness of our nation in a global economy. And it's the great American promise of equal opportunity for all. We look forward to working with the NAACP on these and other challenges well into the future. In fact, just a few minutes ago, we were talking about how we would structure that. But now, to tell us how we'll do it, I'd like to turn things over to my new partner and friend, Cornell Brooks, the President and CEO of the NAACP. Come on up.
Good morning. First of all, let me begin with a heartfelt word of appreciation to Tom Donohue. When we met a few months ago and we talked about the prospect of a partnership between the NAACP and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I was heartened to see that he did not assume that the NAACP represented the end of capitalism as we know it. And it was my attempt to reassure him that we did not assume that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was anything other than a friend in our effort to make this country all that it can be. I want to begin with a word of appreciation for so many people who have worked so hard to bring this day together. And I want to, Tom, extend appreciation to your staff, Jamie Francis and Cheryl Ullman, for their hard work. Can we put our hands together? Yeah. And in this quest for educational excellence that represents the heart of this partnership, we have the rank and file membership of the NAACP, our education chairs, who are here in mass numbers from all across the country. We want to extend our appreciation for you for taking time to be here, as well as the chair of our education committee, Ms. Adora Obi Enwize, here, resplendent in red. Members of our board of directors, Howard Jefferson, and certainly Lorraine Miller. And I also want to thank our some key staffers from the NAACP. The first of whom is Peter Williams, who worked extraordinarily hard in making a conversation between two CEOs that might have been no more than afternoons or days musing into a real project and partnership. And certainly Victor Good and all of the members of the NAACP have worked so hard for us to do this work today. We come to this occasion, we come to this moment at a particularly trying hour in our democracy. When we look across the landscape, the moral and political and civic landscape of this country, we find a democracy in the throes of criminal justice challenges, civic challenges, voting rights challenges. But I've not been to a community from Ferguson to St. Louis to North Charleston or Cleveland or Chicago, where at the heart of our largest civil rights and civic challenges is the challenge of educating, equipping our children to be citizens of this republic. John Dewey noted nearly 100 years ago that education is the bedrock of citizenship. It is the bedrock of our democracy. And we at the NAACP, having led the fight to not only desegregate America's schools, to not only make it clear that separate is inherently unequal, but we led the fight for educational excellence. Because I'd like to remind you that Thurgood Marshall stood on one side of American law with an expansive vision of social justice, an expansive vision of the law, the creative and expansive use of social science encapsulated in a Brandeis brief. And on the other side was the black letter law and precedent. But at the heart of the case, Brown versus Board of Education, was a quest of African Americans for educational excellence. That is at the heart of our civil rights agenda today. And we are extraordinarily proud that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, having been founded within a few years of the NAACP over 100 years ago, is standing with us in the quest for educational excellence in 2015. That is something for which we can all be proud. Being in this building that stands on the legacy and lineage of Webster, being in this city of Washington that represents the crossroads of our democracy and our highest educational aspirations, We are painfully and poignantly reminded that unless we educate, invest, and empower our young people with the best of our aspirations and the best of what this generation has to pass to the next generation, our democracy is in peril. And so we've come together this morning to take up some of the biggest challenges facing not only teachers, not only parents, not only children, but all of us as a country. As we take up the challenge of talking about how do we ensure that our young people have access to the most rigorous coursework, painfully mindful of the fact that we have so many African Americans and children of color in this country that do not have access to chemistry, do not have access to Algebra 2, do not have access to the full breadth and array of advanced placement courses. Painfully mindful of the fact that we have teachers who are ill-equipped to take on the challenges that stand before them, that sit before them in their classrooms. And painfully mindful of the fact that American business cannot be all that it should be in this competitive, globalized economy unless we have citizens sitting in classrooms being taught and taught well, and then going out and occupying workplaces and being able to compute well, and analyze well, and work well, and think about the future that we want to create collectively as a country and as an economy. I'm reminded of these words by Hannah Arendt. That ring true today. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it and by the same token save it from ruin. And education is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and lead them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands their choice of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. We have, in fact, a common world. We have a common democracy. We have a common set of shared values, and we have a common agenda with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And today, we begin that work, we begin this partnership, and I look forward to being in dialogue, in discussion, and working aside all of you. Thank you.
Please welcome Cheryl Oldham, Vice President of the Center for Education and Workforce at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation.
I don't know how I feel about following those two men to the podium. I want to add my thanks to all of you all for being here and to welcome you to the Chamber. Thank you, President Brooks, for those kind words about the Chamber and about our staff. And I want to thank Tom Donohue for his leadership. It's such an honor to work for a man that is so committed to this issue, so firm in his belief that education is the key to opportunity. We have always felt so supported in the work that we do in the Building on Education and Workforce because of his leadership. I want to take just a brief moment to recognize and thank our sponsors of this event, without whom we wouldn't all be here together: the Boeing Company, ExxonMobil, the Leona M. and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust, Intel, and PwC. Thank you so much. As President Brooks mentioned in his remarks, about a year or maybe less ago, he and Tom met and committed to identifying a space in which our two organizations might come together. And I think it was quickly determined that education, and more specifically, the education of African American students in this country, would be our focus. And we wanted to leverage, as we began to sort of start talking, Peter and Victor and Jamie and I, about what a partnership might look like. We really wanted to leverage what is sometimes even more valuable than just these very large national organizations with a great megaphone. But it is the reach of the partners that we have. So for us, it is our Federation of State and Local Chambers all across the country. For the NAACP, as President Brooks mentioned, the chapters all over the country. And so we were very intentional about who we invited to be a part of this conversation with us today. The Chamber is never... we never have a hard time filling a room, right? But we didn't want to just have that conversation within the Beltway among the people that we always talk to. We wanted to bring people together from across the country and hopefully begin to forge some partnerships so that you all could go back home and begin to talk to maybe somebody that you hadn't already known around a common purpose, which is education reform and closing the achievement gap. And so, in order to develop this agenda and to really make it worth your while to come all the way across the country in many cases and to spend a day with us, we built an advisory board of some of our key partners. And I wanted to acknowledge all of them here today because they really helped us, I think, make something valuable of your time. And that's Billy Canary, the CEO and president of the Business Council of Alabama, Catherine Glover, the president and CEO of the Tennessee Chamber of Commerce, John Harmon, the president and CEO of the African American Chamber of Commerce of New Jersey. We have Howard Jefferson, the NAACP Education Vice Chair, Brendian Mitchell, the Education Youth Board member, Adora Obi-Nweze, the Education Chair for the NAACP, and Solois Steele, the NAACP Special Contributions Fund Board of Trustees. Thank you so much for your commitment to us. And commitment to this project and your time and your attention and your thought leadership over the past 6 months. It really has meant the world to us. You just heard Tom mention a few of these or mention the report that we were releasing today. All of you have it. I would encourage you to also visit at leadersandlaggards.org, the web tool that accompanies the release of this report. It allows you to do some comparisons and dive deeper into state-specific data. But as we were putting this report together or thinking about how we would structure this path forward, we knew that we were going to face statistics that were sobering and saddening and sometimes even shocking. But when we saw stats like the ones Tom mentioned, 18% of African American fourth graders proficient in reading, only 1 in 10 proficient in math, we decided we had to do more than just release a bunch of percentage points. We wanted to create something that was for everyone and not just sort of the wonks that spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. So we developed a simple video to break down the report's findings in a way that reaches everyone, a parent, a teacher, a student, a community leader, help you to understand these statistics, tell a story, and hopefully something that you can use. We plan to share this far and wide, and we wanted to share it with you today and hope that you will share it as well.
All American kids can be superheroes, and a high-quality education empowers their success. But lately our schools haven't been super. We used to rank #1 in education, but now we've fallen behind. We are at the bottom of the pack in literacy, science, and math. And what's worse, the progress we've made has slowed. To compete in the complex global economy, we need students to be prepared. In the next decade, 63% of jobs will require a college degree. But with our current graduation rates, we won't be able to fill the jobs of the future. To meet these challenges, all students must have the support they need, especially those who have been underserved. There are more than 500,000 black fourth graders in the U.S., but over 80% are not doing math or reading at grade level. 30% of black high school students do not graduate, and dropout rates are highest in the nation for Latino high schoolers. But the future can be brighter. If we give all kids equal opportunity to excel, they will be healthier, have sharper minds, be more likely to vote, have access to higher paying jobs. And by closing the gap between white students and their black and Latino peers, we could increase our annual GDP by $525 billion. Let's empower students with the skills they need to succeed, ensuring the brightest future for all children. Demand high standards, require accountability, so that every kid in America has the chance to soar. Act now. Visit leadersandlaggards.org.
So it was really important to us that that video, as you noticed at the end, say something about what is really a core principle for us at the Chamber, and that is that demanding accountability for the academic achievement of all kids. And I can't think of a better segue to introduce my friend and former boss, Secretary Margaret Spellings. Secretary Spellings really has worked tirelessly throughout her career to ensure an equitable education for all students. A lot of progress that we have made throughout the last decade is due in part to the policies that she oversaw while both at the White House and then as Secretary of Education. Margaret is currently the president of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas. Prior to that, she served as senior advisor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. From 2005 to 2009, Margaret served as the U.S. Secretary of Education. And prior to her serving in the cabinet, she was chief domestic policy advisor to the president. We're so excited and honored that she will take the helm as president of the 17-campus University of North Carolina in March 2016. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Spellings.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you for your tremendous leadership of the education work here. And Tom, listen, I do not want to get between Tom and Cornell on anything. This is a winning coalition. Thank you all for being here. It's really so terrific to be back in Washington with the mighty strike force that is going to work to close the achievement gap. As Cheryl said, I've had the privilege of being involved with the Chamber of Commerce, both here in Washington at the U.S. Chamber, but also in Dallas, and I know I will be in North Carolina. And, you know, it's just tremendous to be on the front lines of where people are living out and realizing the American dream. And as Cornell said, fundamental to that, of course, is education. When I look at these two logos on the front of this podium, with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the NAACP, I can think of no more mighty partnership that will achieve our objectives. I want to shout out and note other members of the panel and program that will be here later: Senator Murray, Senator Scott, Congressman Scott, my friend and former colleague Rod Page, Mike Casserly, Rick Hess, Stephanie Sanford. This is an awesome team of people that can do the work. I love that this coalition continues to thrive and come together in common cause around these issues to ensure that every single boy and girl in this country can access the American dream. I remember when I was secretary traveling to Little Rock more than 8 years ago to participate in the NAACP Daisy Bates Education Summit. And we had a partnership and a relationship back then together as we stood tall, focused on these goals of closing the achievement gap. I think back on that summit in Little Rock where we honored the actions of the Little Rock Nine by continuing to fight for the civil right of a quality education for all. And I'm so pleased that Terrence Roberts will be on the program as well. We must not rest until the promise of a quality education for every single child is in reach. As you all know, the federal role in education began and was initiated by President Johnson now just over 50 years ago this year, at a time in our nation where we were filled with domestic upheaval, not too dissimilar to today. But President Johnson did not back down, did not shirk from the challenge of the time. And he led and established a federal role in K-12 education for the first time in the nation, with the commitment of leveling that playing field and providing opportunity for everyone. Presidents of both parties built on that legacy of that great Texan, President Johnson, as he fought and sought equal access and better results. Another Texan that I know particularly well, President George W. Bush later, would build upon that moral imperative, that federal mandate to do better on behalf of every single child, and smartly to make sure that we taxpayers were getting some value for our federal investments. President Bush famously coined the term the soft bigotry of low expectations to capture the fact that too often our nation had let poor African American, Hispanic, and special education systems, if President Bush were here today, he'd say just move them through. Just move on through the system, not ask too many questions. In Texas, he worked to eliminate social promotion that undergirded that soft bigotry of low expectation, and he and Mrs. Bush fought hard around issues of literacy for all. As president, he took this movement to the national stage and made it okay for a Republican, a conservative Republican, to talk about a federal role in education. Hard to believe in today's political debate, and indeed he was a different kind of Republican. He worked to upend the old system of just sending checks and hoping for the best, and of course enacted a law with 4 little words that have been driving people crazy ever since: no child left behind. The law clearly hit a nerve. For the first time, the federal government said, we expect to invest in our young people, but we want to see achievement. We want to see results for all. And No Child Left Behind made a lot of people uncomfortable. And as we reauthorize this law, this piece of legislation, just this very day, I hope we will continue to have that discomfort in mind. Many of us here realize that President Bush was right, that we needed to focus on these issues and we needed to bring the business and civil rights communities together to make that slogan a reality. Powerful partnerships like those formed then and continue today and are being emboldened and freshened and strengthened with this effort scare a lot of people, and they get people's attention, just like when we enacted No Child Left Behind. When President Bush and Senator Kennedy worked together, people thought, what the heck? Just like when the NAACP and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce do now. The foes of that point of view, and we have some, often were those who were captured by the system or didn't understand what role the federal government might play. It was strange bedfellows with the business community and the civil rights community, working often at odds with what I call federalists, those folks who don't see any federal role for education, and those who often put the issues of adults before students. We built a coalition that elevated the debate and committed to do the work, and we saw results. Between 1999 and 2008, reading scores for African American 9-year-olds increased by 2 grade levels. 2 grade levels. That's not an accident. And Hispanic 9-year-olds' achievement rose as well. But sadly, the gains have stalled. As the little video said, in the last 7 years, we paint a different picture. The latest data from our National Education Report Card, the NAEP, also are discouraging. Scores in math have dropped for the first time since 1990, and of equal concern, reading scores are in decline. Here's the headline. After 9 years of progress, scores have turned downward in the critical subjects of reading and math, upon which all education achievement is built. When I look at the NAEP scores in my own state of Texas, we see an achievement gap that is wide and not closing, and in the case of African American students, one that has persisted too long. Worrisome trends. But I keep asking myself over and over, we throw these numbers around, where is the outrage? 14 years later, I'm still asking, where is the outrage? The latest Gradnation report had more disheartening news. Just 7 states educate about 40% of the nation's African American students, and all of those states have graduation rates either in the 60s, I mean slightly more than half of the students graduate, or have recently experienced significant declines. Unless these states where these students live start to experience significant improvement, the recent progress made in raising African American graduation rates will stall as well. There are several points I want to highlight in the report that Cheryl spoke of that's before you today. On the 2015 NAEP, only 18%, it's been said before, 18% of African American fourth graders were found to be proficient in reading and 19% in math. The eighth grade numbers are worse, with 15% of African American students proficient and 12% in math. The report looks at readiness of African American students for college on 4 indicators: graduation rates, ACT scores, passage on AP tests, and post-secondary remediation. And taken together, they show that our students, our African American students, are not ready for college. With a little more than half of our minority students getting out of high school on time, how can we rationalize the fact that all of our schools are pretty good and all of our teachers are just fine? Those two things can't go in the same framing, that the kids stink, but the schools are great. You know, when I think about this and I personalize it to our own situation, I think it's a lot clearer to understand. In my secretarial days, I used to ask parents, when do you want your child or grandchild on grade level? When do you want your child doing third grade work? And of course they would say, well, I want my third grader doing third grade work in the third grade. But this idea, this belief that minority parents want or expect less for their children is just wrong. It's just wrong. So we have to stir up a little outrage. We have to use this data and club people over the head with 18% of our kids reading. That's shocking in America. So today, we're calibrating and recalibrating the role that Washington will play in all of this. And I agree, it's well past time for this law to be reauthorized, no doubt about it. And I'm pleased, but not satisfied, but very pleased with the progress that was made. No law in this town or any other capital is ever perfect. And I'm pleased to see that the annual assessments have been retained and that consequences will apply to the bottom 5% of schools. But it's not enough. We are in what I call the era of local control. And that means that everybody in this room has to be engaged in their state and their community and looking at the fine print. Because, friends, we've tried this method before, and we had a lot of decades of underperformance, especially for poor and minority students. And I think those issues have been elevated, but we've got to get over in our local communities and start asking about the fine print and paying attention. Strong accountability in every single city and state and school district is needed so that taxpayers know the value they're getting and the performance of students. There are important questions for us to ask our school boards and our governors and our legislators. How do we use assessments to better align with standards in our state? How can we learn and refine and improve testing and measurement systems? How do we use technology to give more convenient and more readily available feedback to students, to teachers, and to parents? Data is critical. Without it, we cannot improve the enterprise. And we have to use it not only as a flashlight for underperformance, but to herald success and to learn from the places that are doing well. We have a couple of things going on at the Bush Center that I want to highlight for you. We have done in the past something we call the Global Report Card that looks not just how we fare with our neighbors in the states, but how we do around the world. And we're about to put a lot of school district data on that tool. Early last year in our city, Mayor Mike Rawlings approached the Bush Institute about doing a report card so that mayors could engage more vigorously. And last year, we did a report card launched with the Conference of Mayors for 33 cities, and this year we will do 100 cities. I would modestly suggest that perhaps this coalition ought to include our friends at the local level, our mayors, who can come together around that. We cannot and we must not go back to the ostrich approach of burying our heads in the sand and thinking that good enough is okay. And we cannot, absolutely must not, give up on this idea, this moral imperative and belief that every single one of our children can succeed. Our charge is to keep the business and civil rights community, this mighty coalition, together, and to keep our efforts flourishing at the local level. I ask you to channel that righteous outrage into action for coalitions in your community and take the ever-growing crowd of supporters as part of our mighty army. Use the data to shine the spotlight on underachievement and success. Hold everyone's feet to the fire for the promise for every single student, and you can count on me to be right by your side. Thank you all for your good work.
Please welcome USA Today's national education reporter, Greg Topo.
Is my mic on? Can y'all hear me? Up? A little louder? Okay, perfect. Thanks, folks. I'm Greg Topo from the USA Today. I cover K-12 education and higher ed. We have a really remarkable panel to, I think, kind of flesh out some of the points we've heard the previous speakers kind of allude to. You know, I wanted to set the table in a slightly different way this afternoon. You know, we've been talking about things like, you know, third grade reading and eighth grade math, and kind of the menu that we generally get when we're talking about achievement. You know, one of the things that I want to kind of add to the conversation, if we can, is in a way kind of an indicator on the other end, which is sort of at the higher end of this. You know, I just finished writing a book, and during the research for it, I came across kind of an astounding little statistic. I was researching the New York City school system and found that in 2014, Stuyvesant High School, are you all familiar with Stuyvesant High School? So this is, you know, selective, you know, high-powered math and science high school in New York City. And in 2014, they announced the demographic breakdown of their freshman class. And I don't know if any of you familiar with this, but so this is a pretty important school. If you get into this school, you have really made it in the education system. So the size of the class, and I'm going to ask you to kind of engage with me in a little bit of, I guess we'd call it a little quiz. So the size of the class was 830 students, okay? How many students, oh, okay, so 830 students. The city itself, about a third of New York City students are African American, okay? A third. So in the class of 830, how many do you think were African American? 40? Okay. There were 9. There were 9 African American students in the class of 830. So it's about 1%. So clearly, at both ends of the system, we have our work cut out for us here. I want to introduce our panelists and kind of dig right into the numbers here. This is a bit of a sort of a geeky panel in some ways. That's okay, it's after lunch. So all the way to my right is Mike McShane, Director of Education Policy for the Show Me Institute. To his left is Ryan Smith from the Education Trust West in Oakland. And to my immediate right is Rick Hess of the American Enterprise Institute. We're going to start actually with Mike, who gets the title track here. He's going to actually talk about the path forward. We're going to give him a couple minutes to really dig into some of the numbers, just to kind of start the conversation going. Mike.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I can't tell you what a privilege it is to be in this room this morning with so many people working so hard to improve the nation's education system. Really, the honor is all mine. And also, Ryan and I, before we walked out, realized we're dressed almost identically to one another. So I'm Mike. This is Ryan. So if there's any confusion, same sport coat, same pants, but Ryan, Mike. I digress. So I had the opportunity to work with the Chamber of Commerce Foundation to run some of those geeky, nerdy numbers that Cheryl was talking about that were then left out in the video for people, which I certainly understand. But to collect some of this data and present it in the report that I think all of you have at your table. And I don't want to go over each and every individual finding. It's in there that you can look at. But I do want to highlight just a couple kind of top line things that might sort of frame the discussion that we can have and hopefully some of the conversation that takes place amongst this august group over the course of the next 2 days. I think the first point that's worth highlighting is that, as the video did show, the data on the sort of absolute levels of performance for African American students across the country, that performance is low. The numbers are shocking. And in almost every state, we're seeing fewer than 1 in 5 students reading and doing math at grade level. We do include some data in the report that shows, if you track back of proficiency levels from the early 1990s, for example, there has been improvement. And I think that that's something that we really should celebrate. That's something that we should recognize. It's not that there was some great halcyon days in the past in which African American students did much better than they do today. It appears slow and steady progress is being made, but unfortunately, looking at those absolute levels, that far too few students are reaching those goals. And the second, and I just want to echo something that Dr. Brooks said, and something that guided the creation and the finding of some of the data that we chose to use. Things like proficiency, reading proficiency at grade level, things like high school graduation rates. These are obviously very important. But in 2015 and in 2020 and 2025, it is increasingly important that students go beyond these basic measures of proficiency or simply getting a high school diploma. So we wanted to include some higher level indicators. So things like college readiness on the ACT. We looked at college remediation rates and particularly dove into AP scores, both AP scores writ large and honed in on STEM subjects and foreign language, which is something that we think that educated people and people in a contemporary workforce are going to need. So I would draw your attention to those numbers as well. And then while we can talk about things like graduation rates and proficiency rates, rates on those higher level things are important. A third thing that I do want to add is that when you see we have included statewide information, not just for African American students, but for all students, it's clear that no state is really knocking it out of the park on all of these indicators. If you look at things like AP passage rates or even proficiency levels, states are struggling to educate all of their students, so not simply African American students, but everywhere. So I think that's an important thing to also keep in mind, that AP rates, graduation rates, et cetera, states are struggling for all students. And then finally, of course, as a researcher, I have to say that anytime you do a report like this, there are obviously some limitations. The real goal of this report was to serve as a sort of entry point for the important conversations that are taking place here. So as a result, what we wanted to find was comparable data that we could have some points in the past that we could reference to, and try to present it in as user-friendly of a way as possible. Over the course of the past couple days, I've been speaking on a couple radio shows or in some interviews, and whenever you do a piece of research like this, one of the most common questions is, well, why didn't you look at this? Or can you use this data to tell this story? The point of this was really just to be sort of like a temperature check, to put that information out there so that then the people in this room are empowered to have those conversations about why we think these numbers might be the way that they are and what we can do about it. So again, those are the kind of top line issues that I wanted to bring up, and I just want to reiterate what a privilege it is to be here with all of you this morning. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. You know, before I move on to Ryan, can I just kind of drill down on one thing? Can you talk a little bit about AP? Because I think, you know, it's something we're hearing more and more about, you know, access to AP. Some interesting state-by-state findings that I'm hoping we can kind of spend a little time with. Can you just give us like a top line on, you know, some of the maybe the surprises that you found?
Yes, if I can remember all of these. There's a couple thousand data points, I think, in this report, if I can remember all of them. Well, yes. So there were a couple interesting things were found. First, we did try to track numbers on AP access. And we did find, I ran just the one sort of statistical thing I did was a very simple kind of correlational calculation of access and ultimate success. And as one might imagine, in states where more students have access to AP classes, more students succeed in AP courses. And so the definition for success, for those that may be unfamiliar, even though I would assume most folks in this room know what the AP tests are, it's graded on 1 to 5. Traditionally, if you can score a 3, 4, or 5, you will get college credit at most universities for those courses. And we have seen a concerted effort across the country to increase the number of students that are taking AP classes, and I think that that's a good thing. But what we really wanted to drill down on is that AP success. Is how many students are actually clearing that bar, because while it may be a valuable experience to participate in an AP class, if a student doesn't pass the test at the end, they're not getting that college credit. So we wanted to drill down, and again, the numbers we see a precipitous drop-off of the number of states in which African American students, and again, students writ large, are actually meeting with success, getting that college credit.
Great, thanks. And I should have said, but before I introduce, I should have said, being from the Show Me Institute, you're an organization that a journalist loves, right? Because, you know, they're always saying, "Don't tell me, show me."
Yes,
right? You know, so,
exactly. From the proud Show Me state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ryan, so you're from EdTrust West. But before I ask you to react to what some of the points Mike just made, can you tell us a little bit about EdTrust and kind of, you know, a lot of people might be familiar with the Education Trust here in D.C. EdTrust West is another, not quite another animal altogether, but it's got some interesting things, some interesting differences. Can you talk a little bit about, just give us like the 30-second primer on EdTrust West?
All right. Well, I know we have some EdTrust family in the room, so I do want to shout you out. So EdTrust West is a state-based research, advocacy, and policy organization really dedicated to closing achievement opportunity gaps. So we focus primarily on California, and it's warmer where we are than where my colleagues at EdTrust are right now. But you know, we do have some of the, we do look at a lot of the similar types of things that EdTrust looks at, but we also are obviously following trends in California.
Thanks. So I guess I wanted to ask you if you could kind of, you know, reflect on some of the things Mike just talked about, how his findings sort of comport with what you guys have found, and were there any surprises to you?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's really hard not to take a collective pause when you hear this type of data. And sometimes data can really drown over the ears, but when you hear about the proficiency rates nationally and in local states, it's hard for me to take that in sometimes. So I was hearing the data that you were saying, and I was like, you know, we have work to do. And I think it's the late Julian Bond that said violence is black children attending schools for 12 years and receiving 6 years worth of education. And if we think about the work that is that we see nationally, we see that we have work to do. And although we've seen a lot of progress and success, state by state, we could be doing more for black, brown, and poor children. So, that was definitely my initial reaction. I also thought about where we're seeing success in California. So I'm excited about the Path Forward report. I'm excited about Leaders and Laggard report as well. I think we need to be honing in on the achievement of black students. We recently came out with a report called Black Minds Matter, and the reason I bring this up is because this young lady is actually at Met West Academy in Oakland. It's a school that's actually graduating close to 60 and 70% of its black students. 70% of these students actually live in poverty. And I will say in California, we're seeing thousands of black students meeting standards, but we have work to do. So the close to 1 million black students, or I should say black youth in the state under the age of 24, we see these statistics. So we know that they're least likely to be placed in gifted and talented programs. In California, they're least likely to have access to college preparatory courses. They're least likely to graduate high school in 4 years and least likely to complete a college degree. They're most likely to be suspended or expelled. In fact, there was one district, Vallejo Unified, who suspended or expelled 80% of its black students last year alone. 80%. Most likely to be taught by ineffective, the lowest paid, and novice teachers, and most likely to require or to be placed in remedial courses when they're in college. Particularly if you look at community college rates, the numbers of students placed in remediation are staggering. But it really doesn't have to be that way. What we're seeing in California is not necessarily leadership from the state level, but from local districts, and I'll highlight a couple of promising practice. So we see districts like Oakland Unified, San Bernardino Unified, and San Francisco Unified literally start departments almost completely geared towards turning the curve on black student achievement. In fact, Oakland Unified has started a manhood class, which is actually bringing black and brown men together in courses taught by black male students black male teachers and brown teachers in order to increase graduation. They've actually seen a 10% increase in graduation rates for that population since they started that program. We're also seeing a lot of significant movement around access to AP classes. So I know Superintendent Steinhauser is here from Long Beach. Their goal in Long Beach is that by 2018, 50% of their 11th and 12th graders are enrolled and taking an AP course. And it looks like this year alone, they will have 1,500 students taking AP courses. In fact, he doesn't have a place to place those students to take all those classes, and is working on how do you make sure that we can financially meet the needs of those students who are taking those classes. We're also seeing a lot of work around suspension and expulsion. So you may know this, although we talk a lot about young men of color, and I think that's important, although I think that conversation has become very gendered. On average, nationally, African American girls are suspended 6 times more likely than their white counterparts. So when we talk about willful defiance, when we talk about implicit bias, when we talk about structural racism, those things exist and we need to have those conversations. But really what we need to do is make sure that we have strong accountability systems, particularly as we've reauthorized ESEA, that makes sure that these students are achieving at the highest levels.
Great, thanks. And finally, I want to turn to Rick to kind of round out the discussion a bit. Rick, you looked at some really interesting things happening in 2 states in the district. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm turning to you for some good news. And I guess it's that kind of day, isn't it?
It is, every once in a while.
It's like 60 degrees outside. It's on December 10th, and we have a president who just signed an education bill. So like stranger things have happened, right? So talk to us a little bit about some of the findings that you have, and I think they're on people's chairs as well, correct? Really, really interesting stuff.
Sure.
And can you tell us just a little bit about what you do at AEI too?
Yeah, sure. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Director of Ed Policy Studies at American Enterprise Institute. I've been there about a dozen years running our ed program since I left University of Virginia. We look at questions of K-12, pre-K, and higher ed. And frequently what we do is express frustration, which is why this is kind of a nice exercise. Cheryl Oldham had suggested to me back in the spring, I'd had the pleasure of working with the U.S. Chamber for about 10 years now as a collaborator on these Leaders and Laggards reports. And Cheryl said that one of the questions out of conversations had been, we're tracking how folks are doing, we're showing who's leading, who's lagging. What are we doing to show folks how do you move from the bottom to the top? I thought that was a great idea. And so what we did was we thought we would take a look at the states that had made the biggest movements on 4th and 8th grade reading and math and NAEP since we started doing the Leaders and Laggards reports back in 2005, and looked at the folks who had made the biggest aggregate gains through 13. There's various technical issues with trying to do this simple kind of aggregation, but for our purposes, I think it works just fine. And the top 3 folks were DC, Hawaii, and Maryland. For those of you who follow the National Assessment of Educational Progress, you'll know that DC and Hawaii are now the top 2 for the past decade. Maryland, on the other hand, ran into some headwinds and some questions about test practices. This is how these things unfold.
Just mention what the problems were.
So one is Maryland, after the 2013 administration of NAEP, changed the parameters it's using to test its special ed population. One of the things to be cautious of is we often treat testing numbers as if they've been handed down on tablets, and they're not. It depends how these samples are drawn, how these tests are administered, even with something that we all regard as the gold standard like the NAEP. But it's also the case that for the first time in 2 decades, Maryland really had turbulence at the state level, and it's hard to parse out how much of Maryland really hitting these headwinds in the last 2 years was due to the test changes and how much due to changes in state policy. But just a couple key takeaways. You guys can read the report. As a compliment to Mike's pretty numbers-heavy, pretty wonkish study, we try to keep this pretty light and narrative. So let me just put my finger on a couple key takeaways for you. The question is, Ryan's talking about what some districts can do. The question here was, what can states do to support and sustain and drive improvement? Let me mention 4 things. First thing you'll notice is the states we're talking about are all small. Washington, D.C. and Hawaii, in fact, are both local education agencies and states. They have, D.C., including the charter schools, has 75,000 kids. Hawaii has less than 200,000 kids.
So Hawaii is one school district, right?
One school district statewide.
Okay.
Maryland, 750,000 kids, give or take, and just 24 districts in the state. One of the things this means is that when you are trying to drive reform and policy in these states, there's a degree of trust, of familiarity, of agility that often escapes us when we try to take these lessons and bring them to big states where there's going to be a lot more fumbling of the baton as we try to hand it off. Second thing to keep in mind is these states are all models of persistence. DC really kicked off when Adrian Fenty was elected mayor almost a decade ago. Through Fenty and 2 successive mayors, Michelle Rhee and her then deputy and now successor, Kaya Henderson, have held fast to the same strategy, the same model of reform. In Hawaii, in the last 14 years, there have been 2 state leaders / superintendents. The one handed off to her deputy, so you've had the same playbook being run for 14 years. In Maryland, you had one state chief, Nancy Grasmick, in place for 2 decades, and she and her successor, Lillian Lowry, about a quarter century of steady leadership. Oftentimes, we wind up trying to run state improvement like you run a broken college football program. Fire a coach every 2 years, the next guy's going to be a miracle worker. That's not how you build trust. It's not how you build cultures. It's not how you build excellence. Third thing, let me mention real quick, is when you look particularly, say, at Hawaii and D.C., which have been number 1 and 2 now for a decade, almost mirror opposite strategies. D.C. has been about dramatic and transformative policy change. Hard-nosed changes to hiring and firing at the central office, massive reconstruction of how they pay teachers, pioneered the impact teacher evaluation system, and 45% of DC's kids are in this knock your socks off charter school system. Hawaii could not be more different. As leaders consistently will tell you in Hawaii, look, we can't fire teachers because we can't import any. We're pretty much stuck with what we got. Hawaii is very much an island culture. It's collaborative, it's trusting. When you ask people about big policy changes, they talk about legislative debates about what the start times for school should be. So it's just a very different approach, which I think should point us to a simple but pretty uplifting reminder that school reform is ultimately local. It's about parents and communities and children and churches. It's about finding ways to support the people solving these problems in communities. It's not about airlifting into the state capitol in 3 months some recipe book that was cooked up somewhere else. And finally, let me just make the point then, bringing it back forth and finally, that when you're trying to do this, we've often made these debates about, is schooling about culture and professional practice, or is it about structure? And when you look at these places, whether it's Hawaii or DC or Maryland, what the folks will tell you is it's both in sequence. It's structure first, because you can't build a culture on quicksand. You need to be able to fire people who are bad at their jobs. In Hawaii, it was Act 51, which decentralized and created school autonomy so that you could hold principals accountable. In Maryland, it was starting in the 1990s with a testing and accountability framework. But once you've put those structures in place, it's all about people. It's all about culture. It's all about helping people do their jobs well. That's much easier to do in a place that's small and familiar and trusting, which I think helps clarify the challenge for big states, but isn't a reason to throw up our hands. It's a reason to ask, how do we make these lessons work in other environments?
Can I push back on one tiny thing? So, we set the table for this discussion with a word like outrage, right? The secretary asked, where's the outrage? It seems to me that some of the things you are maybe prescribing or suggesting come from sort of the opposite of outrage in a way. Collaboration, steady leadership. Outrage is what gets us, 4 superintendents in 6 years. Nobody would deny that we need a certain measure of outrage to get things done. But how do you square those two?
Yeah, and I think it's a fantastic question. I think a useful one. Greg's book, for those who haven't read it, is really about the power of technology. I think it's the same thing. When we talk about steady, persistent leadership, that's the different from embracing the disruptive power of new technologies and online learning. How do we square that circle? Well, I think what we need to do is, I think what we have to expect of ourselves is that we're able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we have to understand that outrage is the right response to the fact that we are stealing the future from any child. Outrage is the right response, that we are not cultivating a child's gifts, that we are not embracing their opportunity, that we're not wanting for them the same things we want for us and our kids. Absolutely. But in any professional environment, if you're a doctor, the best doctors are outraged and offended by human frailty. They don't go into an operating room screaming and throwing their hands in the air. They go to an operating room channeling that outrage in a constructive direction. The best attorneys get outraged when they feel their clients have been done wrong. So I think what happens sometimes is we think or we act as if the right outlet for outrage is seeing how aggressively we can tweet or how loudly we can speak. I don't think that's the right or most constructive way to channel this stuff. And I think that's the way to think about disruptive innovation as well. Doing this in a persistent, strategic fashion does not mean that we close our ears to the opportunities of education savings accounts, of vouchers, of charters, of online learning. I am a fan of all of these things. Yeah. But I think you want to approach these things with your eyes wide open as part of a thoughtful approach to giving opportunities to all kids, and not as part of some kind of holy war where whoever wins, we wind up with scorched earth.
Okay. You keep getting these applause. This is just some.
Everyone wants as well.
Yeah, everyone's. Yeah. So Ryan, if I'm hearing Rick correctly, he's suggesting maybe we should break up California. What do you think?
I'll say, good luck. We have a history of trying to break up California, and it still hasn't been successful.
But I mean, just from a practical point of view, I mean, I know that I live in Maryland. There are 24 school districts, big county districts. I mean, there are 10,000 school districts in California. I mean,
well, 1,000.
No, I'm just gonna, that was my exaggeration. But still, that's a heck of a lot of school districts.
It is.
Tell me, I don't know, as you think about what he's saying in terms of, the efficacy of kind of everybody knowing one another, I mean, how would that work out in a place like California?
Well, and he mentioned, he was talking a lot about big states, and California obviously is one of those big states. And when we talk about scale, it's a challenge in California to scale promising practice at that level. It's a challenge to think at the leadership level, how do you really get implementation correct? And I think the state is trying to do that. So I will say this. Equity has become at the heart of many of the initiatives that are happening within education, but it's having its challenges in implementation. An example of that is California recently passed the local control funding formula. It actually unlocked all categorical programming in order to give higher concentrations or give more money to districts with higher concentrations of low-income students, English language learners, and foster youth. That was the first time that's happened, and that's a huge shift in the way schooling is done, or at least it's funded. But we know that throwing money at a district doesn't necessarily mean outcomes for students. So what we're seeing at the district level is, even though there's more money to support students, there's grappling with how you should invest those. Where are the promising practices to turn the curve for those students? And then you have people within the African American community who are saying, well, African Americans are not explicitly stated in this formula, so there are a number of students who are not actually met there. So we are having those challenges, and I do think it's important that we start to do things not only from the top down, but from the bottom up as well. I think that's essential. But I also think, you were talking about outrage, and I want to change outrage to urgency. I do think people are outraged, but there needs to be an urgency around this issue. This data has not changed. You can look at it longitudinally, and you can see that in some places we're getting worse. So how are we actually changing urgency to political will? How are we doing this with students and with parents? And it's unfortunate because I go into a lot of these rooms, and the first thing when we talk about this type of data, people say, well, obviously it's about parenting. Obviously it's about culture. And I just find that to be fundamentally false and really offensive. Obviously, there are decisions that adults are making, like access to college preparatory courses, like who gets into GATE, that we can control now in this room as policymakers. And those are the things that we should be focusing on first. Not the things that, like parenting or even poverty. And I will say this, that it's not just an issue of poverty. We see that middle-income Black students are faring as much as poor white students in the state. So there is an issue about race. And unfortunately, we continue to give those who are the furthest back the least. So what can we do now urgently to create the political will to really change the system for these students? And until we have that conversation, this data will continue.
I want to touch a little bit on leadership, something Rick also brought up, this idea, and if you aren't familiar with what's happening in DC, he makes, I think, a really interesting point. Through 3 mayors, starting with Adrian Fenty, we've had essentially the same leadership team in DC public schools. The person at the top changed, but basically they were a team, right? Michelle Reed brought in Kaya. I'm talking from a bit of a place of ignorance here. Are they total outliers as you guys look around? And I'll open this to all of you. As you guys look around the country, we're sort of conditioned in a way to believe that if you have the same person at the top for 10, 15, 20 years, that's just sort of this stale, airless place, or there's some sort of patronage going on. Let's talk about what the conditions are in DC, and how they reflect what's happening in other cities, and how to sort of make that happen, elsewhere. And I'm going to open this to anybody who wants to chime in. Actually, let's start with Mike, because
I think if my data are correct, what the average tenure of an urban superintendent is it 4 years still? Is that about what I think something? I live in
Kansas. Actually,
yeah.
Mike.
3. All right, I was being overly generous. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I believe the Kansas City Public Schools, in my 31 years on this planet, have had, I lost count, something like 27 superintendents, something in my lifetime. There's the sort of data around it, that if this is something that we think is important, and look, I mean, this goes back to Rick's first of many books that he wrote, Spinning Wheels, right? So there was this persistent, I'm sort of summarizing your work here if you don't mind, Rick, but there was this persistent belief when Rick was in graduate school that urban school districts or large city school districts aren't doing anything. They're not doing enough. And what Rick found through hundreds and hundreds of interviews with these folks is, no, actually it turns out people are doing stuff all the time. And every year they're trying something new, or there's a new superintendent coming in, and it creates this policy churn, these spinning wheels, where things aren't able to grab hold and create improvement. So I think that the data bear this out, historical experience bears this out as well. The policy churn can be incredibly disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Right? Sorry.
No, right, good. Oh, I mean, I think it's useful to keep in mind that schools are the most human of institutions, right? This is the problem with trying to do policy solutions from on high, is if you are trying to pave a road, that stuff might work okay. When you're dealing with schools where the quality is the product of thousands of decisions made every day by educators, by parents, by students and how they interact, what matters is whether these places are doing these things well. It's just hard to do that through dictates. As Mike's alluded to, what happens is in districts when you get a sequence of leaders coming in, each with exciting new ideas that somebody found research for somewhere, is what you do is you teach the educators, this too shall pass. The only people who buy into the new reform are the rookies or the gullible. And the rookies learn that next year there will be a new recipe, and after 3 or 4 years they learn to just shut the door and do their thing. And what you do is they become germ-resistant schools, where no reform sticks because everybody's just doing their thing, and every year you get pretty much what you got the year before. By the way, this is one reason why I am such a believer in charter schooling, such a believer in soup to nuts turnaround models, because if you want to kind of get a fresh start on a culture, you need to vacuum seal that place and let the children and the adults build a culture from scratch. But the trick for leaders is it is possible to just become somebody who goes in, puts your suit jacket on the wall every day and does the same thing for 20 years. So it's not like there's magic in longevity. What there is real value in, and we know this in every organization, Ed Trust has modeled this under Katie Haycock for a long darn time, is when you have a fierce sense of mission, of urgency. You know what you're trying to do, you know where you're headed, you have a consistent vision of what you're about, then what you do is you fold in tactical changes, new approaches that support that. That's what we tend to lose. Instead of knowing where these districts are going, like private companies, like professional sports teams that are well run, and then folding in changes along the way, every 18 months or 36 months, we get nervous, we get outraged, we get a political turnover, and we start from scratch. And I don't know any organization, public or private, big or small, that actually is good if it's run that way.
Yeah. So we just have a couple minutes before we open it up to Q&A. I wanted to drill down a tiny bit with you, Rick, on DC, because you talk a lot about sort of how DC is just lapping the field in the achievement. One of the things in your report, you hand out some numbers, and the numbers, maybe they kind of work against your point. I don't know. Median household income higher in DC, per pupil spending much higher than the national average. Adults with a bachelor's degree, twice as high. Charter school enrollment, 10 times as high. Is DC replicable in any way? Come on.
So there's a couple things here. So one, DC 10 years ago was a train wreck.
The folks in Hawaii was rated 46th or 47th by Ed Week in its overall NAEP. Folks in Hawaii said, thank God for DC. So one, now it is absolutely true that DC has seen this gentrification over the past decade. Partly that's the fruit of educational improvement, is it's much easier to get high salary families to move into your city or state when they have some confidence their children will be well served. Partly that's a charter school story, partly that's a DCPS improvement story. Part of DC's gains are absolutely the product of this process. Its children in poverty rate is down about 5 points from 2005 to 2013. Does that explain all or even most of DC's extraordinary gains? No, but it explains a part of them.
Okay.
A really useful resource on this is our friend Matt Shingos at the Urban Institute did a real nice little exercise a couple months back where he looked at NAEP and he adjusted them for state demographics. So if folks are saying, wait a minute, I want to see how we stack up after taking into account some of these poverty and demographic characteristics, that's actually a useful tool for having this conversation.
Okay. Yeah. I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. We have a couple of microphones coming around on either end, and I just have 3 things I'd like you to think about. So tell us who you are, tell us where you're from, and please, please make it a question. Okay? Let's start on over here. The ladies with the mics are in control, so I can't.
Thank you. I'm Gloria Jean Sweetlove, and I'm president of Tennessee NAACP, also a member of the National Board of Directors and the Education Committee. My question is, have you guys got any idea how we try to replicate this in other places where we don't have 1 or 2 districts?
So when you say replicate, what is your favorite part that you want replicated?
How do you make it happen? You know,
Okay.
how do you do it?
Who wants to tackle that?
How do you do it and make it happen when you've got 200 districts?
Tell me again where you're from. I'm sorry. I just wasn't listening closely enough.
All over again. I'm Gloria Jean Sweetlove. I'm president of Tennessee NAACP
Tennessee.
and a member of the National Board of Directors Education Committee.
Thank you, ma'am. How do we export this to Tennessee? Which, by the way, is doing some interesting things, but go ahead. Ryan, you had something you wanted to say?
I'll chime in. I think part of this is that we often work in silos, even state by state. So seeing what Kaya Henderson and the work that's happening in Washington, D.C. and others, we need to be providing more spaces where we're actually sharing and trying to replicate those practices, and I don't think we provide that enough. And I won't say, I'll say this a lot because I think it's important. I think demand is essential for us to change systems. Meaning if we think what's working is working in Washington, D.C., we need to be demanding in our state that we're doing things that are very similar. I think we need to, it's important that we're thinking about data, not just in these rooms, but really it's essential that we're democratizing data so that people within community understand what's essential and why equity is important. But we need the political will. So I think that is going to be very important in order to replicate practice.
Let me just, 2 quick things. First off, Tennessee has been doing some really terrific stuff, and SCORE, for instance, has played just this really useful role in terms of keeping the eye on the ball and lending support and focus. But one of the things that happens in a place like DC or Hawaii, or in a district like New York City under Joel Klein, is you know who's responsible, and they're able to execute on policies. One of the challenges in a place like Tennessee with its teacher evaluation system is the folks who are passing that system in the legislature or writing it at the state level mean well, but they're not the ones who ultimately have to make it work. So it's kind of like telling your kids, look, I want you guys to trim the hedges, do it right. And then they're supposed to guess what right looks like and how to, which can be really hard for them. And so that's just part of and I think one of the things that suggests is those of us who work in DC and at state capitals just need to have some humility and understand that when we try to push folks to do what we want them to do on our wish list, oftentimes it's not going to play out the way we'd like. Second thing to keep in mind is that the key in all this stuff is execution. The ideas matter less than how well the ideas are done. And so partly what that means is when we go and we visit with somebody like Kaya Henderson, or we visit with Catherine Machioto out in Hawaii, and we talk about what they've done, we often spend too much time talking to them about what are the ideas we ought to import, and far too little about how did they go about making these work in their organization. And I think that's one of the places we've just tended to underthink and underinvest.
Over here. Oh, yes. Sir, go ahead.
I'm John Britton, here in Washington, D.C., a veteran law professor, civil rights lawyer, and education equity law specialist. To what extent do you think the change in Washington and in New York of abolishing the elected school board and appointing a chancellor by a mayor makes a difference in this continuing leadership, here or everywhere?
Great question. So maybe one of us can kind of set the table just for the context of the gentleman's question.
Sure. You know, there's about 14,000 school districts across the country. Almost all of them are elected. This goes back a century and more. There's a handful, 80 or 100 districts that are where the mayor actually runs the schools. Chicago, famously, Boston. In D.C. and New York, some of the major reforms of the last 15 years were for the mayor to take control of schools. I think that was a huge part of the story in D.C. and New York. I don't think it's an answer. I think you give up things. You lose some transparency that you get, that you lose some ability to be responsive to community dynamics. In high-performing districts, I think that trade-off maybe says elected boards are just fine. In struggling districts, I think the only way you're going to get the focus, the discipline, the structure, the ability to go out and get somebody who's got the guts to really come in and have the confidence that they can change the game is if they know that there's one person making decisions and that they're four square behind them.
So give us a sense of, like, if these folks go back home, like, what are the things what are the checklist, a short one, I hope you can give us one. What's a short checklist of things that characteristics of their district that would be good for mayoral control?
So if the district is fundamentally broken, if the mayor actually is eager for and wants this responsibility, and if you have confidence that this mayor is not a one-off, but that your city has strong municipal leadership.
You kept that to 3, that was good. Yes, another question. We have only about 3.5 minutes, so if you could, let's make it as lightning round as possible. Short questions.
Frank Humphrey, Wisconsin State Conference President. I am concerned about the issue of equitable distribution of resources. What suggestions do you have for advocates on the front line to be able to use, for instance, the partnership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to put pressure on school boards to really provide numbers that represent part of their budget being allocated to schools that are underperforming, the teachers that they hire, are they African American? Are they experienced? Those kind of factors would mean a lot. But when you go to the school boards, at least at local levels, the data is really absent.
Okay, so the question is sort of, how do you approach school boards for, on the one hand, transparency, and on the other hand, sort of adequate resources? Anybody?
I'll start on transparency, and then maybe someone, you know, in the state of Missouri, for example, you know, our school funding formula, a colleague of mine at the Show Me Institute and a professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis set out to, a couple years ago, said, hey, you know, the funding formula is kind of complicated, people struggle. I want to do like a one page, we can give it out to everybody, they can see the funding formula, and then we can have a sort of debate. When he hit like page 30 of the description, you start to see the issue. So many of these formulae that have been created over time and throughout each legislative session is tweaked one more, becomes this incredibly opaque and difficult formula that even people with incredible sort of statistical training can't parse. So I think one push, and something that would be very helpful for all parties involved, is for local organizations to both just try and create some kind of document and to make it as user-friendly as possible for people to understand all of the moving parts of the funding formula, and then to use that to try and see which parts of that funding formula actually start moving dollars, and then how that works out.
You know, we only have about a minute and a half left. I want to just throw out one quick kind of lightning round question to you guys. You know, the Secretary said, and I'm quoting her here, you know, we were in the era of local control. It's a big change. Give me one good thing that you think could come out of that.
You know, I think the best thing that's going to come out of it is diversity. That we live in a big, beautiful, diverse, and free nation. And that is a feature, that is not a bug. And so given that there are things like 14,000 school districts and a variety of experiences around the country, allowing the people that are closest to the actual children experiencing those things to shape their education, I think on average and in aggregate is a step in the positive direction.
Thanks.
I will say, you know, ESSA gives the opportunity for all of us to be torchbearers for equity. So even though even in the age of local control, we're going to need more people on the ground who understand the importance of equity, who are actually championing this issue of accountability in ways we've never seen before. So as we go back, after this law is signed, we have to go back and build dynamic coalitions that specifically state that no school, no district should be considered good if Black, brown, and poor children are failing. And that's something that we know that happened here in DC, but we must make sure that we're doing that within our states, or we're building accountability bridges to nowhere for our students, unfortunately.
And Rick, you get the last word?
You know, the nice thing about moving this to states and communities is the people making decisions will be responsible for the results of their handiwork. Hold them accountable and hold them responsible.
Great. I wish we had more time, but we want to stick to schedule. If you have any questions for the panelists, I bet they would kind of, if you can take them aside quickly. Thank you so much for listening. Can we take it to the side? Oh, okay.
President sign a piece of legislation that's historical.
Yes.
How can we get an authentic copy or a copy, please?
How can you get a copy of the legislation?
I think it's called, is it Student Success?
Yes, every Student Succeeds Act.
How can we get a copy of that act?
I'm thinking if you went to ed.gov, you'd find it on the front page.
You think it would be at the Library of Congress tomorrow?
I think it's probably been there for 2 hours.
All right,
yeah.
Thank you.
There's a number of great summaries out there too.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Everybody all seated? Ready, set, go. We are so happy to see you. The worst thing in the world they could have done was to put a former first grade teacher from Washington, D.C. in charge of a mic. It's an honor. This afternoon, I have been given one of the greatest privileges that I have received in my career. I never thought that I'd have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Terrence Roberts, one of the Little Rock Nine. When the late and great Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, former president of Morehouse College, in one of his many quotes, made the statement, when a man or a woman is born, they are given an opportunity to share with the world what is distinctive and what is certainly unique. Now, here is the deal with that piece. If a man or a woman does not share the uniqueness and distinctiveness that they've been given, then no one does. Did you all catch that? No one does, because only that person can. And this afternoon, we have someone through Dr. Roberts who understood his uniqueness very early in life. And he also understood his distinctiveness, and he would grow to see it as he grew older. Dr. Roberts, PhD, as we know, one of the Little Rock Nine, who desegregated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. As a 15-year-old 11th grader, he joined 8 other students and became one of the first 9 black students to go to a formerly segregated public high school in Little Rock. Dr. Roberts is CEO of Terrence Roberts Consulting, a management consultant firm devoted to fair and equitable practices in business and industry. A graduate of California State University at Los Angeles, where he received his BA, and University of California, Los Angeles, his MSW. Dr. Roberts obtained his PhD in psychology from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. A much sought-after speaker and presenter, Dr. Roberts lectures and presents workshops and seminars on a wide variety of topics. He has a book, Simple, Not Easy, which will be given as a gift to all of you who are here today, and he will be signing his book at the networking reception this evening. Please join me as one of the most important moments in my life to present one of the Little Rock Nine, none other than Dr. Terrence Roberts. Please stand and welcome him.
Lady, thank you. Well,
Thank
over
you
the
so
top.
much.
That's good.
Thank you
I love it. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. In fact, I'd like to bring you greetings on behalf of my smaller group, the Little Rock Nine. We are physically 8 at the moment. Jeff Thomas passed away about 5 years ago, but we still retain that name, the Little Rock Nine. And I'd like to say a special thanks to all you members of the NAACP for all the very consistent work you've done over many years on our behalf. It's been almost 60, 70, how many years? Maybe 60. At any rate, also thank all of you for being here to give me this opportunity to share some thoughts. I'm particularly interested in what happens in this arena of education. As a young kid in Little Rock, I used to think I had really made a mistake by having charged out of the womb and wound up in a place like Little Rock. And I thought, maybe after all this is an aberration, that outside Little Rock, maybe there are people of sanity. I was disabused of that notion, though, when I became rather ambulatory and found out that the whole world was messed up. I was fortunate enough at a very early age to recalibrate my mental map so that the South for me, and still the South for me, is any region in this country south of Canada. So that helps. That helps me when I'm trying to navigate any given terrain. I have to use this one too? The one is working. Oh, but use this one. Okay. I don't know. Tech people know more than I do. I was doing just fine. Well, education was always presented to me as not one of many options, but the foremost option. The phrase I heard more often than any other phrase as I was growing up was, "Boy, get your education." Everywhere I would turn, "Boy, get your education." And at that point, I was a little confused because I didn't know what education was. They sent me to school, and I began to find out what this education thing was all about. And then I had the very fortunate experience of having Miss Waugh in first grade tell all of us 6-year-olds assembled around her in that September of 1947, "You kids must take on executive responsibility for learning. You have to become CEO of your own independent learning enterprise." I don't know if she truly understood what she did. For me, it was revolutionary because she ignited a spark that lit a fire that has burned brightly since. Along with urging us toward excellence and taking on this responsibility, implicitly she said, develop a sense of curiosity. Ask the hard questions and don't be satisfied with mediocre answers. Find your own answers when necessary. And that became immediately useful because I began to question people in my immediate environment, how and why we got to this point. You see, I was born during the era of separate but equal. This was post-slavery, post-Jim Crow, but another iteration of that same madness. Separate but equal. But even within the confines of that, I found a cadre of teachers in the all-black school system to be dedicated to their task. And I don't know if this is true of any other places around. I've heard some people say they had very similar experiences. But what I advocate today is that every child in America needs what we had in those schools. Every time I stepped onto the campus of Gibbs Elementary, Dunbar Middle School, and the 1 year I spent at Horace Mann High School, I could feel the love. I felt embraced, honored, cherished, loved. That you can't buy. But what it does is to give you the sense that you count, you matter. And when you have that working for you, by the way, you can't buy that, it gives you no limits whatsoever. And so the first grade teacher started all of that, but it was reinforced by everybody else in that system. Tragically, today I hear from a number of quarters that perhaps we should return to that segregated system because it was so wonderful. There's almost a sense of sarcasm there. I don't agree with that. I think we need to find the path forward. And by the way, the path forward cannot be discovered unless you find out where the path is. And how do you find out about that? You dig through the annals of history. You go back to the headwaters. You find out where the trail began. And if you don't do that, you can't possibly understand, even if you find the path, you don't know what you're looking at. In other words, you have to know the history before you can understand the present and begin to articulate any plans for the future. I talk to several groups all over this country, and whenever I go, I ask, how much of the history of this organization have you learned? How much time have you spent delving into the history of who you have become? I work with policemen in Southern California, for instance, and I posed early on the same question, how much of the history of policing in this country do you get in the academy? The answer was tragically nothing. They don't learn about the history of policing. How can you possibly be a police person in this year without knowing the history of how you, well, obviously you see, that contributes to some of the madness we see. If you don't know the history, you're doomed to repeat the mistakes that were made along the way. And so it is, as this stuff is playing out around us with all the madness we see in law enforcement, a lot of people are surprised and frightened, and I say, well, where have you been? I was born in 1941, and I started seeing it in 1941. I've been seeing it ever since. There's no mystery about it. But I was motivated as a very young kid to do my own investigation of the history because I found out another thing. A lot of people are reluctant to discuss it. They won't even have the conversation. In fact, I would raise questions, and a lot of people in my environment would say, don't bring that up. Don't talk about those things. Don't cause trouble. And that last one was particularly irritating because, from my perspective, the trouble was there when I arrived. How on earth could I be responsible for causing any trouble? But I went underground and began to dig. And what I found out, I was impressed recently to see that Ta-Nehisi Coates, in one of his articles, had done the same thing. And he laid out this timetable about the many, many centuries of slavery, followed by Jim Crow, followed by separate but equal, followed by mass incarceration, etc. You know, the thing is sometimes so clear to me that I don't bother to go into all of the details when I talk to people, and I'm surprised that they don't know it too. But we have that responsibility. Wherever we are, at whatever juncture in life, it is important for us to consider what has happened before so that we can figure out exactly what's going on now and what the meanings are. I talked to a group recently called the Alliance for Families and Communities. I'd never heard of the group, but they've been around for over 100 years. They invited me to give a keynote talk at their meeting in St. Louis earlier this year. And as I interacted with the people there, it occurred to me that here was an assembled group of people, all of whom were fervently moving in the direction of trying to create alliances and build strong families and communities, and yet I saw them as building safety nets, weaving together receptacles so that people wouldn't fall below standards or fall through the cracks of society. But as I talked, it occurred to me that perhaps maybe safety net is one thing we used to do, but why don't we now turn our energies to figuring out how we can attack the problem that creates the need for the safety net in the first place? And I did this mid-speech, so I had to create it on the spot. But it worked out. I finally found some words to say to them, and part of it had to do with an experience that I had had myself. A few years ago, I was thinking of writing another book, and I thought, okay, Terry Roberts, you want to take on some subject, why don't you write about civility? As I watched what was happening to President Obama and all of the uncivil things that were happening to him, I thought, yes, that's what we need, is a book on civility. So I started doing my research, and I was well along the way, gathering materials. And then one morning, as I was preparing for the day, I flipped on my iPhone Bible to play some scripture while I got dressed. And I started at Psalm 23, one of my favorite Psalms. But I was a little slow that day, getting ready, and the 23rd Psalm is very short. So it was over, but I let the thing play on. Psalm 24, 25, 26, 27. And I'm putting on my shoes and putting on my tie. Psalm 28, 3. And I perked up when I heard that. And I said, whoa, wait a minute, rewind. I went back, I replayed Psalm 28:3. And the words are, do not drag me away with those evil people who speak cordially with their neighbors but harbor malice in their hearts. And I said, oh, wow, I had an epiphany. Terry Roberts, you're working on the wrong project. You are doing the wrong thing, because if you work on this book on civility, it will be tantamount to trimming the tree, creating some arboreal symmetry that is pleasing to the eye. But the roots are diseased. So I said, okay, abandon this project. So I did. I gave up on that one, on civility. My new project, along with my wife, we're collaborating on a new book called Navigating the Racial Terrain, which will give us an opportunity to identify the roots and identify some of the diseases that have attacked the roots and give us a new focus. Don't stop the safety net building. I didn't want to imply that. That's still essential. But also begin to work on digging up the roots. And let's do some replanting. Let's do some treatment. I have a gardener who's always trying to convince me to treat my trees. He wants some more money. But at some point, I'm going to go ahead and do it, because I realize that there's some logic there. If you have strong roots, then you don't have to worry about what's coming up, because it's usually going to represent what's underneath. Same thing with us as human beings. Who we are outwardly is a function of the foundation that we stand upon. And what is that? That's what we learn over a lifetime. Because let's face it, the biggest thing any of us own is a storehouse of ignorance. I'm well aware of mine. I know on any given day when I wake up, my first order of business is to learn something, because I don't know much. In fact, as I practiced psychology, I practiced psychology for about 30 years. I closed my office recently. But I would always tell prospective clients, look, I don't know how to help you. You come to me with a problem. It's your problem. It's not mine. I have no idea what it's about. But I wanted them to know up front that I was not a miracle worker, that I did not have any insights that I could share with them that would immediately get rid of whatever was bugging them. But what I did say was this: I know something, and whatever I have, I'm going to use it to your benefit, but we're going to work together. If you will join me in a team effort, I think we'll be able to find some solutions that will work for you. But there's no assurance that that will happen. I want to be very clear about this. And a lot of people want referrals to some other people. Oh, okay. The same thing happened when I taught in school. You know, I have found that we collectively have become like sheep almost. We do it because it was done before. I think we have to investigate that and ask why we're doing it that way. I would do a syllabus at the beginning of a course, and I would put at the top in big letters, draft. I would hand it out to students. Students, this is the draft of a syllabus as I understand it. It has to do with what I think I want to learn, but I want you to change it because I don't know what you need to learn. Do you know over the course of my teaching career, I had not one student to amend that draft? That's when I started thinking about, oh my, these students have been turned into sheep. They'll do anything I say. And I didn't like that. I wanted them to challenge me. So by way of example, I would challenge them. Some of them began to balk at that. I remember teaching one course on race. We had to make it mandatory because we figured students wouldn't sign up for it. And even so, they were very timid about signing up. They would come to my office and say, well, Dr. Roberts, you're going to teach this mandatory course on race and we have to come? And I'd say, yes, mandatory. Is it safe in here? That was the question. And I would yell back, no. How can it be safe? Life is not safe. But again, if you're willing to join me in learning about this stuff, together we can create an environment that will work for us. And we'll figure out the safety issues as we go along. What is that about anyway? I still get that. Students today, I'm not on campus anymore, but my wife still teaches, and she tells me they have this new thing they call triggers. Have you heard about this? A lot of students are complaining because they are triggered by words or phrases or video scenes or still photos. I'm thinking, what is that about? We're growing adults in this country, in this world, in this society. It's important for us to be able to deal with what you call triggers, or anything else for that matter. And you can do it if you're willing to find out how. And how do you do that? One, you recognize your own storehouse of ignorance, but realize that's not a permanent condition, and so you actively try to change that on a daily basis. So one thing you do is read voraciously. You find out. You talk to other people. You engage. You involve yourself in the activity. There's an old saying attributed to someone, I can't remember who says that it's important to be actively involved in the action and passion of your times, or risk the peril of being judged and never to have lived. Does that mean 5 minutes? Oh my God, okay. This is just a warm-up, okay. But it's okay, I've been kicked off stages all over the world. But in the last 5 minutes, my start in life in Little Rock, I have come to appreciate. Admittedly, at first, I thought it was the wrong place, but now I understand it doesn't matter where you start, where you end up. That's the more important thing. You start where you are, and you never settle for anything less than your very best. That much I picked up from the educational system. One last thought about education, though, before I do quit. Sometimes people confuse going to school or going through these institutions with education. That's all wrong. That's erroneous. That has nothing to do with it. I had to learn as an individual, I had to learn how to jump through the hoops of the systems while at the same time learning. That's necessary even today. At some point, maybe we'll put those two together. And I hope out of this conference will come some amazing ideas for those kinds of things. We do our children a disservice at all levels when we expect them to equate education with going through the system. That just is not true at all. And in closing, Jonathan Kozol, in the preface to his book, Death at an Early Age, said that the most pernicious thing any adult can do to any child is to meet him or her with minimal expectations. And I say that especially as a message for Justice Scalia, who just today uttered these words that suggested we should not meet African American or brown students with high expectations. Let's hope he is open to reform, or maybe, well, in any case, I have to go. But thank you very much.
Please welcome News One Now host and managing editor, Roland Martin.
All right, now, so how we doing? That's all y'all got? That's it? Sound like the after lunch crowd. Certainly glad to be here, glad to be with you and to have interesting conversation here. Of course, dealing with the issue of rigorous coursework and trying to make it work for our students. I guess is quite timely after yesterday's Supreme Court hearing to have this conversation. I want to first introduce our panel right here. We have Michael Cashley, Executive Director of the Council of the Great City Schools. Stephanie Sanford, Chief of Global Policy, Advocacy, and Communications, College Board. And thank him for our weather, Chris Steinheiser, Superintendent, Long Beach School District. I want to jump right into it, and so there's no need for us to go through long introductions, things along those lines. When we talk about rigorous coursework, first of all, I need for you to define, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for our students when you hear rigorous coursework? Because for some folk, it can mean one thing, and it's totally different for another district.
So I'll start. Happy to start, and then I think it's probably worth talking to each of the other panelists at the College Board. I mean, rigorous coursework or advanced placement. We've heard some references to that, and that is, sort of well planned, well taught, and aligned with college credit, and really designed to promote critical thinking and problem solving skills across a range of disciplines.
So I guess my definition would be somewhat similar. When we think of rigorous coursework, we think of work that is at grade level, is complex. It asks the students to not only to learn information, but to apply that information to practical problems and the like, and is capable of moving them forward to the next level of educational attainment.
And I would add that it means open access to everybody. So it's not, there's no, gatekeepers, which we call gatekeepers in the system, and that it really is preparing everyone for college and the world of work so that they're successful without remediation.
And if we're talking about obviously trying to increase that, we have to deal with the reality that when we're talking about schools, districts, cities, and states, we're not talking about what's equal. And so it's interesting how when we get to the college level, we have this sort of equal conversation as if we're totally ignoring what's happening in primary and secondary schools.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I know one of the things that we're going to bear down on a little bit in this panel is access to advanced courses like advanced placement and other honors courses. But I think all of us would be the first to tell you that that access to honors courses at the high school level really starts at the preschool level. And frankly, your ability to access and be successful in these advanced courses in middle school and high school is really dependent on how well you are prepared at the pre-kindergarten level, at the kindergarten level, and all the way through elementary school. Otherwise, the advanced placement courses that you want to get access to are not likely to be within your grasp.
And then I would add, it's really about local context. So I'm really fortunate. I have my own local university, my own local community college. Our mayor is 100% supportive, as is the business community. So we have a thing called the Long Beach College Promise, where we all work together to ensure that everyone is prepared for college without remediation, and if they do need it, how we change their schedule in the 12th or the 11th grade to fix those issues of any deficiency they may have. But it really goes back, as Mike said, from preschool, because I work directly with my School of Education to make sure that the teachers who are coming into my system have that same level of expectation that all children can succeed. And it's collaboration and how to deliver the best candidates for that job.
So if we're saying that it really goes back to preschool, well then how do we then track and prepare? Because look, as you keep going from first to second to third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and all the way up, by the time some folks get to high school, they are so far behind, you can forget the conversation about advanced placement classes. And so how do we then change the focus educationally from with educators plus advocates and parents to say, if you don't deal with that kindergarten through fourth, fifth grade, we're wasting our breath 5 years later?
Well, I'll just share what Long Beach does. We call it early learning. So we take and I have 6,000 kindergarten students. Of my 6,000, 75% of my kindergarten students are in my own preschools, and about another 15% attend private preschools. So we work with the non-public school preschool teachers as well as the private school teachers and our K-3 teachers on what the continuum of learning is, and then all those safety nets all the way up the road. Because in an urban center, you're always going to have people coming in, students coming in, who may not have experienced the rich program that you have. So you have to have safety nets and interventions all the way up to the path. And when you get into the high school level, and you have an open access program like we do in Long Beach, which means anyone can take an AP course with the exception of 2 areas. Without any prerequisites, calculus, which you need to be prepared for, as well as foreign language. But then we work backwards to help those students where they have deficiencies, as you've talked about, and how to get to the level they need to get to.
Yeah, one additional thing that I think is worth pointing out is how school districts, particularly urban public school systems, improve the overall instructional quality of their program from kindergarten all the way up through the late elementary grade, and the dividends that pays. In one of the previous panels, we talked a little bit about the District of Columbia and why it is that they were seeing such gains in their academic performance. And one of the things that Rick Hess actually left out of that equation in describing why the District of Columbia was doing as well as it was doing is that DC and places like Boston and Long Beach and Charlotte-Mecklenburg and Denver and other places are bearing down on the quality of and the rigor of their instruction from the earliest grades to make sure that those kids aren't falling behind and are at a place where they'll never access an advanced course when they get to middle school or high school. But that instructional focus that is relentless and built around increasing the rigor of these courses in many ways is really what's key to the success of these districts.
And what you're hearing here, and you heard from Rick as well, is a real sense of coherence. That throughout the entire system, they build quite coherently from preparation to then what comes next. At the College Board, we're working to bring that kind of coherence to high school and the relationship of assessment to courses and practice. It sounds sort of banal to say this, but student work has to change for student performance to change. So we have, if you think about, taking an assessment that in 8th grade as you come into high school, so that a kid and a teacher and a parent knows exactly where they are. That enables you then to pick courses really well and carefully to be able to be prepared to finish and be college or career ready. The idea, we've got the PSAT. We talk about how there's a big sort of testing backlash as though assessment was really a barrier. And the way we see it is that assessment without opportunity is dead. The idea is that assessment ought to be something that tells you something important about what a student knows, and then enables, whether that's intervention or enables personalized practice and enables real progress. And we believe that that's a real component of being much more transparent and clear about student learning and student progress.
I believe in best practices, and so give me a couple examples of places where they have taken that knowledge and then instituted proper practices and shown the results by the time that person is a junior and a senior and they've graduated.
certainly.
Well, a couple of places that have are really doing great work on AP that we're talking about at the moment. One is Long Beach, and I think Chris can tell you more about that in a minute. Charlotte-Mecklenburg is doing great work on this front. Miami is doing great work on this front. Houston is doing great work on this front. Some of them are using the results of the PSAT to at least try to figure out which students have promise and then trying to channel them more aggressively into advanced placement courses. But some school districts are going beyond that in terms of being more aggressive about paying for the advanced placement courses, developing professional learning communities around advanced placement, increasing the number of advanced placement courses in their high schools, so you're not having to go to a specialized school in order to get access to an AP course.
And to build upon what both Mike and Stephanie have said, so for example, in Long Beach, we mandate that all 8th through 11th graders take the PSAT and 12th graders take the SAT. And so then we work, when we get that data...
Now, when you say mandated, and again, who's paying for that?
Well, the district pays for it. So I just paid for every 30,000 students to take the PSAT and 6,000 to take the SAT. And so in January, when I get my results, we will be moving students into support classes and interventions that they need based on that data. So if they're on the college road, fine, we'll leave them alone. They're doing well. If they're not, then we go from there. We pay for all students in the district. No student in the district pays more than $5 to take an AP test. Last year we gave 10,400 exams. This year we predict we'll give 15,000 exams. And 91% of my students who are in AP, which is 43% of my 11th and 12th graders, which represents about 6,500 students, take the test. And so we also pay for free SAT prep. But again, it goes back to, it's a system of accountability. We set goals, we look at the data on a regular basis, and we require, and we've learned from our partners in Hillsborough and Miami and every other place, these best practices, meeting with our folks, working on all professional development for our teachers, as well as support structures for our kids and their parents.
Yeah, one of the other things, as long as we're on advanced placement discussion, that we have to keep in mind, and it kind of goes back to the earlier points that we were trying to make about early childhood education and the rigor of coursework in the elementary grades, is that while we're spending a lot of time, our group and the College Board are spending a lot of time trying to get kids who are eligible for advanced placement into advanced placement courses, actually the percentage of African American students who score well enough on a PSAT to be in an advanced placement course is moderately high. It's about 50% of all African American students who score well on a PSAT will end up in an advanced placement course. And closing the rest of that 50% is really important, but the important number here is that while 50% are eligible, the total number of African American students who participate in an advanced placement course is only 4% of their total numbers in the 10th grade.
Obviously, the next question is why?
Well, the reason why is that they're not scoring well enough on the PSAT to even be identified as eligible, which means that their preparation in the elementary grades is really weak. Which means that we're not giving them the rigor of instruction, the quality of instruction. This is where disproportionate resources and teachers and facilities and materials and all of that comes into it to play. And the effect is that the numbers of our kids who do well on the PSAT to even get them to advanced placement is really low. So this is just to underscore the importance of not focusing just on getting eligible kids into AP, but making sure that they will be prepared to even be eligible.
Clearly, I think you've got two distinct issues. One is the number of African American young people that are actually prepared to do well in an AP class. But then we do have large numbers of African Americans who show, based on their PSAT, that they are absolutely prepared. And of the number that don't take them, 75% of them actually have the course available in their school. And so, I mean, so if you think about the numbers
which is again why I'm asking.
Right. So
why? Because if the classes are available and they're eligible and they qualify, what is the reason they aren't taking the classes?
That's a great question. I love this group here, perfect for advocates. Is simply in cases the adults didn't ask them to, they didn't know about it. I mean, Chris, you're closer to it day to day, but it is, I mean, part of it is a nudge of a kid that they know that they're eligible and they know that they're available.
And the reason we've been very successful in increasing the number of African American students taking it is that we've actually gone to the field and asked the students the exact same question. And the kids will be right up with you. Mr. Steinhauser, it's not cool to be smart. In my neighborhood, X, Y, and Z. So what we've done is to hire students who are African American, Hispanic, and others who have actually gone out and be recruiters for them and tutored those students. And we've gone to the African American churches and we've worked with our advocacy groups and with our parents at large to understand why this is really, really important. And we have a group that meets on a monthly basis called the Concerned African American Parents of the District. And we get about 150 parents on a regular basis coming to talk about this issue. And then they're the ambassadors to go out into the community.
So that's what you're doing at Long Beach. But with the College Board, how are you pressing other schools to say, look, this is the problem, because if you can't figure out why these kids are not taking these classes, look, there's nothing we can do. And then once they get to the university, that's the end of the road as opposed to the beginning of the road.
So one is the smart and strategic use of assessment, which you're hearing these great districts do. Two is the identification of young people and letting them know so they can go get those classes. In 25% of the cases, the classes are not available. This is a place, as I think about the chamber colleagues here, where Google has stepped up in the case of STEM courses. And they have actually, with support, put 527 AP STEM courses into 320 high schools for the first time. And so what that was able to do was to then, at least make where students have shown AP potential, that they have that available to them. The other question is, how do you engage adults? And how do you get that information into the hands of adults to be able to have those kids into those classes?
Yeah, one thing that I think this particular group can be really instrumental on is exactly what Stephanie is talking about, and that is working with the parents, working with the kids, working with the schools to try to ensure that the kids know about it, the kids see themselves in a way that encourages them to pursue these courses, to make sure that they have high expectations and that the school teachers have high expectations of these kids. So this coalition, which I have to say I'm thrilled is beginning to blossom, that is the coalition between the NAACP and the Chamber. I think the business community and the NAACP all around the country at the local level, particularly in the big cities, could be really important, instrumental here in helping us build pathways towards more advanced courses in our urban public schools.
But also, I think what also has to happen here, this also boils down to a narrative. And one of the things that I believe schools have failed at consistently academically is establishing a success narrative. Now, these very same schools can establish a success narrative athletically. So they can state very clearly who the #1 draft picks have been that have come through their schools. When your top college coaches come on the campus, they know very well who are the athletic All-Americans. And I think part of this deal is, as well, in the positions that you're in and others, is challenging those schools to say, how are you establishing your academic all-star teams? How are you touting those individuals who come through your schools, who are now CEOs or who are vice presidents, who own their own businesses, and saying, this is also an all-star? Because the reality is, if I never see that, then I will never realize that I can be it myself.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And urban public schools need to take even greater ownership of that dynamic than we do. I think the narrative of high expectations is something that is critically important to our school districts, and is frankly one of the reasons why urban public education was one of the first entities in the education world to embrace college and career-ready standards, because we understood what the damage had been of low expectations and low standards across the country over decades and decades. And part of the work of these districts now is trying to move that narrative to a place where high expectations are the norm and not the exception.
Stephanie, have you, in your capacity, have you identified schools or districts very specifically that have not been doing a good job, and targeted them in a way to say, all right, we're going to sort of put you guys on the clock. There needs to be a 1, 2, 3 year plan to raise the number of folks who are taking these classes who then are in a position to take the SAT and then go on to college.
We typically go for more the opposite direction, which is to recognize schools and districts that are doing really well. So identifying the AP honor roll and recognizing those that are doing really well, and publicizing those in the hope that creates momentum and awareness of actually how to do it, rather than targeting those that don't do a good job.
Okay, but I get targeting those doing well.
Yeah.
But I still believe there's value to target those not doing well. Let's say you had 3 levels: doing well, doing okay, doing bad. And then you're able to say to those who are doing okay, this is where you are, 10, 15, or 20, whatever, and this is, we know you can do better. This is what we want to see in those who are not doing well. That also gives them the encouragement to say, to raise your game, because I think what happens is we're very good at identifying and celebrating success, but also not challenging folks at other levels to raise their game.
We sort of gave, I mean, that's a great description of an effective accountability system.
So can you do it?
Well, that's not really the college one. That's much more the role of states and districts as a part of their accountability systems.
It's actually one of the things that an organization like mine does. We're not just a body that represents and advocates for urban public schools, but several years ago we published a major report on the academic attainment of African American students in our urban schools. It was a report called A Call for Change. Some of you may have read it. But in many ways, it had a more damning set of statistics than anything that has actually been talked about today. And it was a way for us to blow the cover on ourselves, because if we don't own up to the fact that our schools have not served well African Americans, poor kids, students with disabilities, English language learners, and others, then we are not in much of a position to improve our overall performance. We have followed that up with technical assistance teams to the big city schools that have had the lowest performance, and we put together a pledge about a year and a half ago that President Obama announced, by which we would, across all of the big city school districts across the country, we pledged a series of actions on preschool, on raising academic performance in the elementary grades, on suspensions and expulsions, on graduation rates, on ninth grade completion, on advanced placement and the like, and now are working with our districts on the implementation plans on how it is they are going to meet the elements of that of that pledge on behalf of all of our African American
So
students.
you released that report several years ago. Why not do an annual report card? Why not? So like when I think that we mentioned the NAACP, the NAACP used to put out every year a report card on the hotel industry, on several different industries. And when that report card came out, those folks who had A's, they were happy. Those folks who had B's wanted A's. And if you got a C, D, or F, you got a problem.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and it goes back to the issue of accountability that Stephanie was talking about. Frankly, we don't think it was good enough to issue a pledge and have everybody sign on to it and have the president announce it and all of that. We don't think it was good enough for people to do implementation plans and for us to work on strengthening what we have all agreed to do as a coalition of urban public school systems is to develop a scorecard on each city, on each element of the pledge. So we measure ourselves and our progress on preschool, on academic performance, on advanced placement, on suspensions, on expulsions, on graduation, and we do it, and we disaggregate it by race and gender so we can tell.
That's done annually.
We will start the first round of data collection in January. It'll be released next fall for the first time.
And in California, a group of 8 districts called CORE, which represent 1 million students, have done exactly what Mike's talked about. Because we don't have an accountability system right now, it's on a hiatus, it's being developed. We created our own report card that will actually, we just released it and it'll become public in January. And it drills down every school. If you have 20 students of any subgroup, it's part of your accountability system. And you, as Ryan said, you cannot be considered a successful school if you're not serving these students well. And it looks at absolute scores as well as growth over time. And so we banded together exactly what you said to look at what are those promising practices out there on about 11 different indicators that we consider important to be successful after they leave us.
So is that again done every year?
Yes, it's done every year, first time this year.
Yours will be done every year as well?
Be every year as well. And just to make a point here, you know, after we published all of that data several years ago, and it's not that we didn't know that we had an achievement problem and that we weren't well serving a good swath of our students. We knew that. We hadn't quite quantified it in the way that we ultimately did. But one of the things I was really proud of the urban school leaders across the country is that they really stepped up on this set of issues. And truth of the matter is, we didn't get into this business in the first place to see the institutions that we run simply reflect, much less to perpetuate, all of the inequities and low expectations that too many of our kids face. I get it, we get it, that the great civil rights battles that Terrence and others were involved in weren't fought so our kids could have access to mediocrity. They were fought so they could have access to excellence. We are doubling down on ourselves and holding ourselves now accountable explicitly and publicly for raising student achievement for students that we have historically left behind.
All right. Let's take some questions. Right here in the yellow.
Just a second, I've got a microphone for you.
All right, so hold up, I got this here. So here's what we're gonna do. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Give me the mic.
Doc Jones.
We're gonna be here all day. So I got the mic. Put your hands in your pocket. I got this. What's your question?
Okay. So I'm wondering what we're not looking at. The first woman to get a PhD in this country was born a slave. She got it in Germany in German. The first millionaire woman in this country did not have preschool and strong education. The first published woman in America was a slave who came here not speaking English. So what aren't we looking at? There's something we're not looking at. So I'm just wondering what would happen if kids who wanted to take an AP, who did not make the cutoff score, were allowed to try it.
Oh, absolutely, totally agree. There's
yeah,
nothing about AP potential that says don't do it.
Yeah.
It is designed to say, you know, that if you show potential, then let's make sure that if you have the potential you're in. But there is nothing that says that if you don't, that you shouldn't be able to try.
You mean schools are not using a cutoff score on certain assessment to let you take an AP?
That is not what the purpose of AP potential is.
Open access, actually, and I'll speak for Long Beach. Open access means that anyone who wants to take on this rigorous work is welcome to do it, with the exception in my district of a foreign language. You can't take AP Japanese if you've never spoken a word of Japanese. But then if I have action plans out here, each school has its own action plan, how to support those youngsters so that they are successful. Because in some cases, students are going from what I'm going to call a regular class to remember, AP is a college level class, so we want everyone to be successful. So we have what's truly open access, anywhere can go.
Question. A number of big city school districts across the country are making the same kinds of moves. Jacksonville, Florida, where A. Philip Randolph graduated, is starting to do exactly the same thing.
All right. Yeah, my name is Michael Alston. I'm a senior staff engineer with Qualcomm in San Diego. I wanted to address the issue of why kids wouldn't sign up for AP classes in high school. It starts much earlier. They have to know what they're aspiring to. What we've done at Qualcomm is establish the Think a Bit Lab. We bring in middle school students to spend a day with us at Qualcomm and let them tinker with motors and fluffy things and make something move. Program a computer to make something.
Fluffy things.
All kinds of knickknacks. And kids use their imagination, create something within a few hours. They programmed a computer to make a motor turn a feather or a wiggly snake. By the time they leave, they know what engineering is about. And they now think, oh, maybe I want to be an engineer. And so at the middle school age, they can aspire to do that in high school. We just replicated this program in Lewis Middle School just last week. So now middle school has this set up on their campus. It's very exciting for the kids.
So you want more field trips?
Well, it's getting the kids hands-on experience at an early age so they know what to aspire to. It's something that can be replicated.
All right. Question over here, and I'm over here next. I got you. Woosah. All right. Put your hand down. That's why I'm here. Put your hand down. I'm going to hit your hand.
Good afternoon. We know each other, so this is okay that he keeps telling me to put my
I do this all the time.
All right. Good afternoon. My name's Elena Beverly. I'm with the University of Chicago, and I'm also on the Special Contribution Finance Board for the NAACP. So I thank you for your presentations. At the university, we have the Chicago Consortium on School Research, and they've proven that by focusing on the 9th grade year, that we can improve our graduation rates, particularly for students of color. And I was appreciative of your presentations on early learning, but we see, and the importance of AP courses, but we see that graduation rates for African Americans students are at 71%. Could you speak to the role of the 9th grade year, since so many of the advocates in this room could take that information back to their school systems?
Cool.
Sure. We in Long Beach, with the core districts, we have what's called an 8th grade high school readiness index. So we've actually identified certain metrics that if you aren't on track in the 8th grade, you won't be successful in the 9th grade or high school. So we actually are targeting in the 8th grade to go to the 9th grade. And Ryan talked earlier about a male initiative that Oakland has. We have a similar program in Long Beach. We call it the Male Academy. We actually have it in the middle schools and high schools. So in high school alone, we have 750 young men who get together and are in special classes and programs and initiatives. And the graduation rate for those young men is 82% right now, with about 80% going on to college. And these are youngsters who I'm going to call non-traditional leaders who would never have graduated if they didn't have that support. So you're exactly right. I would argue it has to go back to middle school, though, not just the 9th grade.
Yeah, this is we thought it was so important as a kind of broad strategic thing for urban schools to bear down on, thanks to the work that the Chicago Consortium had done, is that we had built that 9th grade course passing rate into the pledge that we had developed, and also have a set of statistical indicators on exactly that point, because it's so important for the long-term success of these kids.
And then to be able to use then assessment results to drive meaningful practice, we've launched a project with the Khan Academy that you can take your PSAT results and you can literally send them to the Khan Academy, hit enter, and 6 seconds later you can have a personalized practice that literally says, you're really great, Mike, at fractions, but you're not so good at dividing fractions. And you would have a bunch of practice on that, and you can practice over and over to know how you're getting better, to know what you need to work on. The idea is to be highly specific about where strength and weaknesses are so that we can be able to, in their cases, target instruction and coursework, and in our case, target new practice.
All right.
Hi, my name is Brenda, and I would kind of want to get some more information, but I believe that there's a gap in the AP courses and where the student decides that they want to go to college. That once they do take that test and they have their results, that colleges have this, let's say a 4 is the number that the student can then get credit for this class. So the student has invested in taking it. If they have to pay, or, you know, I'm not sure what happens with that, but then to get the college to actually accept the course. So I would pose then that, you know, what is the real role that the school, the high school, can play in collaborating with the colleges to understand really what is the benefit for the student to take it? Because rigorous, we're saying rigorous, but we have students who really don't have just a foundational, wonderful high school experience, but yet we're pushing and talking about rigorous and AP. Well, what's the gap there? Is that really why the students aren't interested in taking it? Knowing that, are we really going to get the college credit for it?
So the question about AP credit is a great one, and obviously one of the big motivations for students taking on all of this extra work to do a rigorous coursework that's actually a college level course is to be able to get this credit. And now this last year, Virginia, Texas, and Illinois passed statewide credit policies, and there are 14 other states who have that. So we really believe that that if a student has done, as you said, has done that work and earned that credit, that they ought to be given it. And that much more clarity and predictability about getting the credit will help more of them step up and do that. And so that's a terrific issue for the folks in this room to really talk about, because it absolutely is both a signaling effect to be able to have kids work harder in these classes, but also a reward for the hard work that they've done. As well, if you think about ultimately the goal being both high school graduation, but then also post-secondary completion, two greatest predictors of whether a student is going to finish higher ed are the rigor of their preparation and the real or perceived affordability of going. And their work in AP, rigorous preparation, and if they can get credit, then it both reduces the time and the cost of college for them.
One other thing, I think Stephanie is absolutely right on point. But one dimension that I'd like to add to this is just the expectations of adults. And I don't know that there's any necessarily good or smooth way to interject this, but I would just like to join with Terrence earlier and with Roland earlier too in condemning the remarks of Supreme Court Justice Scalia. I don't know if you are familiar with what it is he had to say yesterday, but in listening to the arguments on the affirmative action case at the University of Texas, he suggested that maybe African Americans ought to be going to less rigorous universities. This is expectations voiced from the highest levels that ought to be condemned by all of us. As an organization, my group, the Council of Great City Schools, will issue a statement right after this meeting condemning Justice Scalia for his statements and the attitude and sentiment behind it.
Question.
I hope I can make a comment.
Put your hand down first, though. I got this.
Okay, my comment is simply that International Baccalaureate, which is a part of the advanced placement, are elitist terms. And our children, quite frankly, were not invited into that elitist terms. Present company excluded. We're here obviously because we're trying to better education for everybody. but I think we can all agree that it is an elitist phenomena, and they did not invite many of our children who were qualified because parents don't know. We must go to the parents and let them know what their children are capable of and how wonderfully they can do in school, and why can't my Johnny get into AP? Now, the New York State NACP has a program just for parents called Lift It. And it's not the cake baking PTA, it is a program of knowledge, navigating the system for parents. And I think this is a wonderful venue, and we should have a clearinghouse in the future where all these ideas and great strategies can be shared. Everybody talks separately, but nobody shares.
I got a question for you. So that's the New York City or State Conference?
I'm Audrey Gould, the New York State Education Chair, and we have a program called Lift It for parents only.
So how many?
They get into a parent leadership academy once they complete the course.
So how are you building that scale-wise within the NAACP? Are there other states that are replicating what you're doing?
Well, we hope to. We've only started this 3 years ago, but we have about 15 chapters in New York State, upstate and downstate, who are very actively involved. Parents are very excited because they want to know what's best.
Right. So what I'm saying is, I would say a starting point to replicate it would be within the organization.
We started it, New York State, and we're trying to spread it. And we have the manual and everything.
You want me to call Cornell Arouse for you?
No.
Okay, I'm just checking. All right, here we go. Question right here. I'm going to go over here and I'm come back over here. I got you.
While you're lining up the next question, I'd just like to acknowledge the work of New York State, because it's one of the only states, mostly through Board of Regents member Lester Young, who is on the Regents, who is taking a very aggressive set of steps in conjunction with my brother's keeper. And just kudos to New York State in doing something that no other state has moved as aggressively on.
Got a question here. Did you just ask for a selfie? Really?
I didn't ask for a selfie.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
My name is Daquan Love, member of the NAACP National Board of Directors and former chair of our National Youth Work Committee. My question to Stephanie, with regards to the College Board, as a former teacher in North Carolina's lowest performing high school, the question that I raise is in regards to teacher training for these AP courses. I've seen it firsthand where districts are cash strapped, the districts give minimal training for the AP courses, and ultimately at the end the students suffer. So are there any initiatives on your end at the College Board level to ensure that all of the teachers, if they're in a high-performing school district or a low-performing school district, have adequate training so the teachers are able to deliver quality content and adequately prepare our students for these exams?
No, so that's a great question,
Alrighty.
and one that we get a good bit. And we're working on teacher tools, things called AP Insight and other kinds of trainings, and in addition to sort of AP teacher workshops, AP teacher conferences, but ways in which we can expand, use technology and other online tools to be able to expand that. Happy to talk more specifically with you offline.
Yeah, Atlanta is another place that does that explicitly, not only providing ongoing training for advanced placement teachers, but also trying to build a pipeline of more diverse AP teachers.
All right.
Hello, I'm Jamela from Georgia. And I have two questions, well, one question, but it goes together. So there are two forms of bias, which is content and exposure bias that comes along with this AP exam testing. So in low-performing schools, when you have educators who are trying to meet the needs of whatever standardized test they're being given, if they're not making the grade, they're given this canned content and curriculum that teaches kids to just regurgitate information. When they get to high school and they are starting to take AP exams, the test is no longer regurgitation of information. But if you've been trained in regurgitation of information up until high school, how is it that we can expect for students to pass an exam that requires them to think critically? So how do we stop that? That's the first question. Where does the rubber meet the road there? In addition, when we are testing students for all sorts of content, are we looking at a wide array of content? Are we looking at who is creating these tests, who is having the input, and what areas are being valued or privileged that may prevent access?
Cool. Anyone?
Yeah, I'll start. I can only speak from my experience in Long Beach. I've been there forever, so 33 years. So we actually, we don't have a canned curriculum. The assessments are developed in concert with our higher ed folks. So for example, in history, our AP teachers, the professors from the university would get together, develop end of course exams and go all the way down into the elementary schools. So I probably spend $11 million a year on professional development. We have multiple what we call professional learning communities. For example, the AP teachers, we just developed 3 new professional learning communities for history, calculus, and in English language, AP language, and looked at every teacher who did extremely well with all kids, but more importantly with EL students and students of color and students who were in poverty, where their results were off the charts. And so those individuals are leading the others, and we stole this idea from Hillsborough, to be honest with you, and Jacksonville, and that's the power of looking at promising practices, because it really is peer-to-peer with accountability. And I would throw something back at you. I would say all of us in this room have to be advocates at our local as well as our state level to ask how we're spending the money, how we're being transparent about it, how we're being transparent on our results, and what are we doing if we're not getting the right results that we want to get. So that would be my argument.
All right, here we go.
Yeah, again, on the curriculum issues, again, one of the reasons why urban schools were so aggressive in both pushing for and working to implement the Common Core standards was because we understood that too many courses were being watered down, expectations were being watered down, kids were getting not access to the high quality curriculum and expectations and instruction. They were being tracked off into lower level courses. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to move aggressively on implementing those higher standards and then making sure that they apply to everybody and that everybody has access to those high-level instructional content.
And on the question of assessment, I mean, we've had a big testing backlash, in the wake of the discussion and in the wake of the reauthorization. And Mike's group put out an extremely influential report in the last month or so about the proliferation of tests over the last 10 or 15 years. I believe it went from 7 in NCLB to 112 in your average district. And so, within that context, concerns about sort of the purpose of assessment and the design of assessment, and at the College Board is we're redesigning our entire suite of assessments and updating our AP assessments, and we really believe that what happened in that proliferation was the sense of, and it was implicit in your question, that testing was unfair and testing was inherently punitive, and certainly it was excessive. And so we've, approached this with sort of 4 key principles about assessment, and I think they're responsive to your question, which is, 1, that you assess only what students are learning in the classroom and those things that are most important that they will use over and over and over again subsequently and then in college and career. 2nd, that assessments must earn students and their families something worthwhile. And whether that's information, that's personalized instruction, that's college credit. 3rd, that ensure that students claim the opportunities that they've earned. And so we talked about, AP credit, that if you've worked hard and you've gotten your 3 or your 4 or your 5, that you ought to be able to get, that assessment ought to get you that college credit. Or in the case of PSAT, we now are tied to over $180 million worth of scholarships. If you take that assessment, it ought to give you something valuable, and we need to be able to talk to kids and parents and be sure that they know about that and that they claim those opportunities. And then finally, and this is about the relationship of assessment to curriculum to practice, is that the only things that really change students' performance are productive practice and great courses. And the nice thing about that is that people in this room are well positioned to help make those things come true for students.
All right.
I think it's also important to to hold your local school districts accountable for the assessments that they give. Assessments can be a very, very important thing for informing instruction and trying to figure out where you're going off track, but they can also be a mechanism by which you exclude kids, and that's when it becomes a real problem. We ran into one of our cities as part of doing this big testing report that was actually giving kids one set of tests in order to see whether or not they were high enough to include in the accountability system of the school district. That is, you had to score well in order to be counted. Now, this is not only exclusionary, it's just downright wrong. So you can play a very important role in pressing your school district to be, as Chris said, transparent about their tests and how they are being used to improve instruction, not exclude kids from quality programming.
This final question, short answers. And then we have coming up next, Senator Tim Scott and Secretary Rod Page. Here you go.
Willie Ann Moore from Toledo, Ohio, State Education Chair for the state of Ohio. My question is to any of you. What are your professional development for your teachers? Because we know that all of the young teachers don't come perfect, and they're not high quality teachers when you first get them, when they're neophytes. How much money do you spend on professional development for those teachers? Are they mentored by your tenured teachers? And part number two, if in fact you have teachers, as the Great City Schools director said, if you have teachers that you know do not have that high quality and that they're in the urban areas, what are you doing to correct that? Because those teachers need help.
All right.
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's one of the reasons why our group has been clear about setting high expectations for teachers, evaluating teachers, at least in part, on how it is their kids are doing, providing mentors and the like for teachers, not all of which our Great City Schools actually do. We have a very bad habit of throwing new teachers into a classroom and hoping for the best. A lot of the school districts, including Chris, where they've made a lot of progress. DC is another one that you probably heard Rick Hess talking about earlier, are school districts that have very aggressive recruiting programs, screen for the best, evaluate, observe, and continuously support their teachers on the path to being better and better and better all the time.
Panel should always have homework. Your one thing you want folks to do leaving here, just one. Nellie, real quick.
I would say engage with young people and help them to identify those opportunities they've earned and take them.
Chris.
Be involved and advocate at your local level.
Michael.
One thing I would invite is for your budding partnership, the NAACP and the Chamber, to work with us at the Great City Schools and other urban school districts across the country in an expansion of your partnership, so we can bear down on these achievement gaps that are clearly so intolerable.
Mine is real simple, and that is you should make sure every school creates that plan for who is an academic all-star. Because if we keep showing the folks who are stars on the basketball court and the athletic field, you should be able to do the exact same thing for folks off the field. And so when you show that, that gives those students a whole different view of people who are successful, who are ballers and shot callers, and it changes their perception. So that's one of the things I think everyone should do. Give it up, please, for our panel, Michael Cashley, Stephanie Sanford, and Chris Steinheiser.
Please welcome Cheryl Oldham, Vice President of the Center for Education and Workforce at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation.
So I'm going to be really, really quick because we have a really special guest with us, and I know he's a tight time frame, so we want to get as much time with him as possible. I'm very honored to introduce to you this next panel discussion. U.S. Senator Tim Scott grew up in a poor and in a single-parent household in North Charleston, South Carolina, and uses the challenges and lessons of his youth to power his agenda in the United States Senate. Senator Scott's opportunity agenda, much of which we'll hear about in a moment, is focused on guaranteeing a high-quality education for all of our nation's students, ensuring access to job training and workforce development programs, and creating a government that empowers the American people. Senator Scott will be joined by Dr. Rod Page. The son of a school principal and a librarian, Secretary Page rose from humble roots in segregated small-town Mississippi all the way to the United States Secretary of Education. From 2001 to 2005, Dr. Page served in the first George W. Bush administration, is also my former boss. As the nation's top educator, he championed student achievement and employed best-of-breed solutions to raise national standards of educational excellence. A member of the presidential cabinet, Page spearheaded the implementation of No Child Left Behind with the goal of reinvigorating America's education system. Please join me in welcoming Senator Tim Scott and Secretary Rod Page.
Yes, sir. All right. Kick us off? Well, good afternoon. It's good to be with you. How you doing there, Dr. Page?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. I'm pleased to be here with you.
Thank you, sir.
Fun when we were together last time.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess we'll just take it off on our own.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to begin by just thanking the NAACP and the Chamber of Commerce for this important gathering. Especially in NAACP, we all owe a great deal of gratitude to this great organization. We would not be where we are now if it were not for the profound work of this great organization. We arrived here as uninvited pilgrims in 1619, and we've been out of slavery less time than we were in slavery. And you can look and see now the progress that's been made. Much of that is attributable to the organization called the NAACP. Now we have another problem. It's a little bit different from the problem we've had in the past. This problem has to do with the education of our children. I won't go into all the statistics and things like that because I understand that Margaret Spelling and Rick Hess did that earlier, and so you know all the data. And it's clear that how we've been working is not working. So it's time now to take a new look and to find great leadership so we can conquer this problem that's been holding us back for years and years and years. All the great progress we've made, despite that, can be broadened and elevated if we can conquer this education issue. And we need leadership to do that. And so I'm glad that we've got now the leadership of an organization that has brought us this far to begin now to really emphasize and elevate solutions to the problems that we have in education. This is not to say that we have not been working in education. I'm very conscious of that. At one time, I served as third vice president of the Houston branch of the NAACP. And I know we focused on education, as I later served as a superintendent of the Houston Independent School District. But the point is, we need to take a good look at how we've been working and see what results that's getting us. And the results that it's getting us was expressed this morning by Secretary Spelling and Rick Hess. So I'll cut that short, Senator Scott, because I want to thank you for your leadership in it, because you've been a stellar leader in that regard, and I thank you so much.
Thank you, absolutely. It's certainly something that's passionate. I'm very passionate about the issue of education because, as you heard in my introduction, that I have seen the good side of life and the bad side of life, and frankly, I've caused a lot of my own pain and suffering through the educational process. The reality of it is, having done poorly in education and then getting it right has been a powerful part of my narrative, and the main reason why the opportunity agenda that I focus on spends so much time talking about the opportunities through education. And we have this widening chasm, this gap between the haves and the have-nots in our country. And if you look at the outcomes of education, you see a part of the solution to making that gap smaller. And if we don't focus on education, then we really find ourselves in having a daunting task to accomplish the goal.
Yes, thank you. We all celebrate the idea that the No Child Left Behind Act is now on a path to be reauthorized, which should have been done years ago. And we hope that the President will go ahead and sign the bill, and we begin to take off in that regard. But we can celebrate that policy being successful. But I'm here to tell you that the policies are just the start. It is not the finish. And so while we celebrate, we got to understand we got to do a lot of work underneath that policy. To give you an example, the Texas legislative apparatus had 13% in its last legislative session, 13% of the legislation had to do with education. In fact, there were 567 bills before the House and Senate in Texas this last legislative session. So we meet every 2 years. So you can imagine almost every 2 years we have close to 600 bills dealing with education go through the Texas House and the Texas Senate. And when you look at the scores on where we are in our progress of where our kids are, you can see that policies alone will not get that done. Rick Hess, in his speech, made a key statement that I'd like to emphasize. His execution is where it really happens. No matter how good that policy is, how that policy is executed is the determination of the kind of value that is to be put forth. And I think that execution has long need for the policymakers and the practitioners on the ground in the environments. And so that's where the organizations such as the NAACP and other organizations with these kinds of goals can be effective to make sure that these policies are implemented properly so that we can get the results that are intended.
One of the things that we're trying to work on from a policy perspective really has to do with not only education but also work skills, because what we've learned very quickly is if you don't have the work skills, that the opportunities are evaporating as well. When you look at the future of our country in the next 10 to 20 years, the necessity of the middle skills, so more than a high school graduation, but not quite the 4-year degree, there's a real appetite, a need for the middle skill jobs. They say that 45% of the new jobs that we'll see in America will be filled by someone in the middle skills. So the importance of the certificates, if not the 4-year degree, is critically important. Some of the studies that I've seen reflect that 4.7 million is the number that we will need for these middle skills. We'll have a shortfall of about 4.7 million folks who have the right certificates to do the right work from a middle skills perspective, and only about a 3 million person shortfall from a degreed perspective. So the opportunity for those kids who want to be on one path towards the certificate is critically important, and a wonderful opportunity in South Carolina where we are Americans that can make things. The high-tech manufacturing world is a classic example of where those middle skills will meet real opportunities to have a wage that is 20 to 30% higher than the average wage in our state. A classic example for us is Nucor Steel. Here's a company that pays based on production. And so many of the workers at the Nucor Steel plant in South Carolina can make as high as 6 figures based on a high school education, but with skills. And so my focus, along with Cory Booker, has been working towards an apprenticeship program model that provides incentives for companies to take a second look at those kids who may need to earn and learn at the same time. And then I focus on education, looking at, if you're looking at the polling information, I like to look at the crosstabs from state to state to figure out an opportunity for real success, and whether it's charter schools, private schools, public school choice, giving the parents as much of a cafeteria plan as possible is a place where we could see a lot of traction occur for kids living in poverty. So the two pillars from our perspective has been focusing on educational choice and at the same time looking at apprenticeship programs as two key solutions in certain parts of the country. I happen to go to a public school that was pretty good in high school. I went to 4 different elementary schools by the time I was in the 5th grade, so some were good, some were not so good. So making sure that we have options for the parents is so critically important. Both realized, myself and Corey, along with Diane Feinstein and Ron Johnson, the team working on the DC Opportunity Scholarship is a classic example of when in a challenging area you can provide more for the parents, and the kids' satisfaction, their grades, their graduation rates, their college attendance, and then all of that correlates to higher incomes when they get into the workforce because of things like the Opportunity Scholarship Program. And we've seen the same thing happen from in a program. We've both seen very clearly classic examples from South Carolina, New Jersey, and around the country where he and I have been able to champion the issue of apprenticeship programs consistently together.
That's kind of taken off, I think, across the nation. We're seeing that states are developing where they're asking the high schools to provide a curriculum track that provides a grounding in those early skills so that when the student leaves, they have deployable skills. For example, I think it was in Texas House Bill 2. I may have that wrong, but it requires that those kinds of opportunities are provided for students. So the Texas curriculum has to be redone all across to provide those kinds of programs early on. I was just visiting some schools last week where their CTE programs were providing students preparation to take certification in those fields. And so even coming out of high school, they're coming out of high school with certifications in medical billing, medical records, respiratory therapy, and things like that, so they could absolutely have a skill that could give them a decent income even before they finish college.
And it really does, it does translate in a very powerful way, in a very tangible way when you look at the results of apprenticeship programs and other programs that are designed to make sure that the necessity of or the requisite skill set is possessed by the applicant. And how many of you guys remember SHOP in high school? Okay. And everybody said amen. I mean, so here's a classic opportunity for us to see an pathway that includes real skills and it translates into real income. One of the things that I think is interesting to watch, and you guys have been here all day and have heard from some amazing experts, and so some of the things that we say may be duplicative or redundant, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at the lack of success in the workforce for the person who does not graduate from school, income levels around $19,000. If you look at the kid who graduates from high school, it's typically around $28,000. If they go on to get a 4-year degree, or its equivalent, it's around $52,000. The difference between $19,000 and $52,000 is experienced and felt not for a year, but for a lifetime. And when you add those numbers up, what you find is for the kid that was like me, about to flunk out of high school as a freshman, the difference in income is over $1 million in one's lifetime. I'm not sure about you, but a brother can use $1 million. I don't know about you. I just know that $1 million is real money. And I just remember flunking out of high school as a freshman, lost, drifting, looking for who I could be, and thinking about that kid that I visited just 3 days ago I think it was in Greenville, South Carolina, at Carolina High School, talking to these kids where in 2010, 48.8% of the kids graduated from high school. So take the numbers that I just talked about, the 19, the 28, and the 52, expose that over a community where only 48.8% of the kids are graduating from high school. So take that $19,000 and multiply it out and see what the effect is. But when you're thinking about that, out of the 50% that did not graduate, only one of two typically are looking for work. So that $19,000 income goes with the person who's looking for work, and then there's half the folks who aren't looking. .4% to 63% to 72.8%, and this year that school wants to graduate 85% of their kids. I call that, somebody should say thank you to the Lord. I'm sorry. I thought I was in church for a second here. I see that. I like this table right there. Y'all must be from South Carolina, praising the Lord like that. Anyways, and if you just multiply those numbers, 85 versus 48, 19,000 per child versus 28 per child versus 52 per child. The cost, the opportunities, the family formation, the cohesion, it's a beautiful thing. And having been the kid on those numbers, we're talking about real people who are truly looking for a way out. And a simple solution, education, the closest thing to magic in America. Powerful.
It's a good statement. I'm going to use that. The closest thing to magic, education. I make a lot of speeches. That'll fit right in. It's like,
Just give me credit the first time.
yeah.
The second time you'll forget me. That's okay, though.
No, I'll keep you in mind all the way down.
Yes, sir.
We just got a few more minutes, and I want to make sure that I make this point. Some will agree, others will not. As we celebrate federal policy, like the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind Act, and we feel success when that is signed into law by the president, I just want to make sure that it's clear that the policy is not going to get the thing done. What's going to get the thing done is the implementation of the policy. And that implementation, the key place, and I can only say this because my experience has been both at the highest level in policymaking and at the highest level in practitioner. I was a superintendent of the 7th largest school district in the United States of America in Houston. And there's two different worlds. These two groups, the practitioners, are looking at the policymakers, and the policymakers are looking at the practitioners with jaundiced eyes. But this gap has to be closed, and part of that work has to be done at the level of the school board. They are the groups that elect the superintendent, approve the budgets, oversee the operations, the real actors that make the big difference. So to deal with these numbers that Secretary Spelling and Rick Hess gave us, we're going to have to make sure that at this operational level, not only at the policymaking level, this operational level works well. And so great leadership is needed in helping make decisions about who are the people who are going to get elected to these school boards. Who are the people that are sitting around the table making these major decisions? Whose interests are they working? Who are they accountable to? That needs to be a public and leadership at that level. Otherwise, a lot of gaps take place. and the system does not work well absent that grassroots leadership that can come from organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, and other great organizations. And so I'm taking advantage of this moment to call on us to really kick it up a notch in this type of work, because we need leadership, and the only place that leadership can come from is great organizations like the NAACP.
I'll tell you that when we look at the challenges from a statistical perspective on education, and then we translate that to the workforce, the one thing that I'll tell you that as a Republican working with Cory Booker, who's a strong Democrat, sitting down and finding common ground so that we can make sure that we're not looking at our partisan labels, but that we're looking at the people that we serve and looking for ways to serve them together. The one thing that has been quite successful in our apprenticeship program is that Cory finds, which I'm almost embarrassed to say as a South Carolinian, but Cory is looking around the country for the best model that he could find for an apprenticeship program. He calls me up one day, or sends me a text actually, and says, Tim, I think I found the right program. I'm like, well, cool, let's talk about it. He's like, you're not going to be happy about where I found it, though. I'm like, well, you're a New Jersey fellow, I can deal with New Jersey, maybe New York or something. He's like, no, I found it in your backyard. In Aiken, South Carolina, there's a great apprenticeship program. And so it was shock, and I was dismayed. We sat down, we talked, and we just found real common ground based on the fact that here's a nationwide world-class program being implemented in parts of South Carolina where we're seeing amazing success. And so he called me and laughed at me for a little while, and I didn't think it was funny, but he laughed anyways, and we sat there and had a good time about a success story that we were able to then partner with for the last 2.5 years as we try to move it through the legislative calendar, looking for a way to make sure that kids, specifically under 25, though we have a second part of it that allows for those over 25 to receive benefits and credits as well. But the goal was to make sure that we provided access to opportunities through the apprenticeship programs. And the classic example, of course, for us was the MTU company in Aiken, South Carolina, where we saw so much success that we wanted to take that program, replicate it around the country, and hopefully make it a national standard. And frankly, now I've had a conversation with the president about apprenticeship programs. Hillary Clinton came out for some apprenticeship programs. A number on my side have come out as well. So our hope is that as we're moving forward, there aren't many areas where Congress gets along really well all the time. I know that's shocking information to all of you guys, but the fact of the matter is that we have found many places now in apprenticeship footprint that we feel like we can make progress together, and we are looking forward to making that progress.
I just got the flag that we got 2 minutes, and so I'd like to thank the senator for his leadership, and I've had a chance to bump into him several times, and I've been really respectful and admire you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to again thank this organization, the NAACP. There's no words that can truly express the gratitude that we in a nation has for this organization, because of the power of the work that is done. But we're going into a new world now. This new world is quite different from the old world. And the problems that we solved in the old world are not the problems that we're going to have to solve in the new world. But the one thing that's going to be common about it is that education now is becoming a very, very powerful determinant of success and functioning societies and that kind of stuff. No matter if we solve all these other issues, if we don't fix this education issue, we still got a great big problem. And this can be only done only with great leadership. We need leadership from great organizations like the NAACP.
Y'all have a good day. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. If I can ask you to just take your seats. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. I can assure you, when we started to plan this event almost a year ago, that we had no idea that it would land on such a historic week for education. As has been mentioned a couple times today, yesterday the Senate passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization, the first major overhaul to our nation's K-12 education policy since No Child Left Behind. It took leadership, bipartisanship, and I imagine a little bit of patience by our next couple of speakers to accomplish the Every Student Succeeds Act. The Chamber spent the last 9 months in a coalition with our friends and allies in the civil rights community to fight for principles that ensure access to high-quality education for all children, regardless of zip code. And I would not hesitate at all to say that without the two people that are joining us, one right now and one hopefully in a few minutes, that we wouldn't have a bill, let alone we wouldn't have a bill that focuses on accountability for the academic achievement of all students. We're grateful for their commitment to crafting legislation that includes so many principles that we've fought for. Congressman Scott is scheduled to join us, is running a little late due to some votes, but we have the pleasure to welcome Senator Murray to the stage to make a few remarks. Senator Murray has been serving as a member of the Senate Democratic leadership since 2007. She's currently ranking member of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee and is a proven and effective leader supporting equitable education for all students. Please join me in welcoming Senator Murray.
Well, good afternoon, and Cheryl, thank you so much for that recognition. I really appreciate it. I also want to recognize all the members of the Chamber of Commerce and the NAACP from my home state of Washington who made the trip here today. Great to have you all here. The topic that you have been focused on for this conference, equality in education, couldn't be more important, and the timing couldn't be more perfect. Just today, as you probably know, President Obama signed into law our legislation to finally fix No Child Left Behind in a way that helps ensure all students get access to education. I want to thank you. I want to recognize all of the members who helped us get our bill over the line, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and that would be Ranking Member of the House Ed and Workforce Committee, Bobby Scott, who will be joining me hopefully here in a few minutes, as well as Chairman John Klein and Chairman Lamar Alexander. I am so glad that the four of us were finally able to put partisanship aside and work together on our bill to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA. You know, it has been 50 years since President Lyndon Johnson first signed ESEA into law. And when he was younger, President Johnson took a year off from college to teach school in a small border town in Texas. Every student at his school was Mexican American and came from a low-income background. The school didn't even have a school bus. And President Johnson recalled using his first paycheck to buy volleyballs and softball bats so that kids could have playground equipment. He said that he would never forget the faces of those boys and girls at that school, knowing they would likely not go to college because they were simply too poor. President Johnson said that that was the moment he realized, and I want to quote him, "This nation could never rest while the door to knowledge remained closed to any American." And of course, our nation had always held the ideal of education for all, but in 1965, ESEA put that ideal into action. It aimed to close the education gap between the rich and the poor, black and white, kids from rural areas and kids from big cities. And in doing so, ESEA took a step forward for civil rights. We've been working for about a year now to reauthorize that law. And throughout the process, I have fought, along with my colleagues, to preserve the law's civil rights legacy, to make sure all students have access to a quality education, regardless of where they live, how they learn, or how much money their parents make. You can see that in the progress we made on holding schools and states accountable for educating every student. And you can see that in the progress we made to help shine a light on discriminatory disciplinary policies that are too often aimed at students of colors. Let me start with the accountability, and I give Ranking Member Bobby Scott a lot of credit for helping forge a compromise on such an important issue. The fact is that we know what happens when we don't hold our schools and states accountable for educating all of our students. Invariably, it's the kids from poor neighborhoods, kids of color, kids who are learning English, and kids with disabilities who too often fall through the cracks. Our bill will make sure that schools work to close achievement gaps that too often affect those students. And for schools that struggle the most to help students succeed, and for high schools where more than a third of their students fail to earn a diploma, our bill will ensure that they take steps to improve. You know, back in the 1800s, Horace Mann, who's often called the father of American education, worked to make it universal and free for all. He famously said, "Education is the great equalizer," and I agree, but only if we commit ourselves to providing each and every child with the opportunity to learn and grow and thrive. As I mentioned, our bill also makes progress on harmful disciplinary tactics that rob students of their chances to learn. Back in June, actually, the Seattle Times from my home state had a story about this very issue. The reporter wrote about an African-American student named Malik, and the first time that Malik was suspended, he was in the 3rd grade. Then came missed field trips, more suspensions, and last year he was expelled from school. Malik told the Seattle Times reporter that after a while he started to dread going to school, and he said, quote, "It just felt like nobody wanted me there." So last year in Washington State, we know that 10% of all of our students who were removed from the classroom were African American, even though in my state those students make up less than 5% of the student population. And that is a trend that tracks with what is happening across the country. So in our bill, for the first time, we require every state, every district, and every school to report and publish which students are suspended and expelled. We also require schools and districts and states to report when students are referred to law enforcement and when they make school-related arrests. We hope that that will really shine a light on the data that parents and teachers and schools and local leaders like all of you need to help to break down that school-to-prison pipeline. And for an added step, states and districts will have to detail how they plan to reduce the kinds of disciplinary action. See, I was a preschool teacher and we just didn't discipline like they do at the tactics that take students out of the classroom as a condition of receiving Title I funding. And if school districts need extra help in making that a reality, our bill provides some new funding so they can follow through on that goal. So I think those are really important provisions of the bill that was signed into law today. Now, there are several other ways our bill will expand educational opportunities for more students. For the first time, our nation's primary education law will include dedicated funding for preschool or early childhood education. That is a condition that I said I will not support this bill going forward without it in it. I'm very happy that the bill that we signed today takes an important step forward on that. This is an especially important provision for low-income backgrounds, students from low-income backgrounds. You know, by the time an average child growing up in poverty turns 3 years old, she will have heard 30 million fewer words compared to a child from a middle or high-income family. And that's according to researchers at the University of Kansas. By the time she's 3 years old, she will have heard 30 million fewer words. Think about what a serious disadvantage that is. And by the time she starts kindergarten, the deck will already be stacked against her and her future success. The Every Student Succeeds Act establishes a competitive grant program for states that propose to improve coordination, quality, and access for early childhood education for kids from low-income and disadvantaged backgrounds. Our bill will also shine a light on resource inequities in our schools. There are resources like offering AP classes right now that we need to have the resources for. Our bill provides that, and that depends on how much funding districts spend on students and access to preschool and a lot more. I know that is a topic that all of you have been talking about here today. And across the country, we know that the students in some of our schools just don't have the same opportunity to graduate college and career ready like other students do. In fact, you should know that 1 out of 5 African American high schoolers attend a school that doesn't even offer an AP class. Not a single course in AP. So our bill will require all schools to report on those issues to help shine a light on resource inequality. And in districts that are struggling, our bill will require school districts to do something to remedy those inequities. Now, as important as this new law is for education and for civil rights, this alone is not enough to guarantee that all families have the opportunities to succeed here in our country. In 1965, ESEA was not a standalone effort. It was part of a movement. It came along with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and a lot more in that decade alone. And just like in the 1960s, what we need right now is a larger movement to make sure the promise of justice and equality shines through not just our education system, but our justice system, our economy, and our country. We need to end racial profiling by law enforcement at all levels. That is why I support a bill that's been put forward by Congressman Conyers and Senator Cardin as just a first step. You know, police officers are extremely important to our communities. They help keep our families safe. Racial profiling only serves to destroy the essential trust and cooperation between law enforcement and our communities. We also need to reform our system of justice by changing mandatory minimum sentence practices, the 3 strikes policy, and putting an end to solitary confinement for juveniles. And once someone has paid their debt to society, these individuals should be able to re-enter the community and earn an honest living. That's why we need to ban the box, so more people who have turned their lives around get a fair shot at getting a job. So those are just a few of the steps we absolutely need to take, and take soon, to help make sure our system actually provides justice and equality for all. And we as a country also need to make sure our economy works for all Americans, not just the wealthiest few. You know, in today's economy, too many workers across our country are underpaid, overworked, and treated unfairly. When a worker lacks economic security, when they're not treated fairly, they cannot invest in themselves or their children or move their families into a secure middle-class life. So I believe we have to address this issue on multiple fronts, and I've been very proud to partner with Congressman Scott on a number of those priorities. For one, we need to increase people's income that have far too long been stagnant. We need to make sure that women get equal pay for equal work, which right now, by the way, disproportionately hurts women of color. I was very glad actually to see the California Chamber of Commerce endorse bipartisan equal pay legislation in their state, and I hope that we can build on those kinds of efforts in other states and here in Congress. And we should make it a little easier for working families to earn a paycheck and raise a family. That's how we expand economic opportunities so more Americans can get a shot at success in our country. And really, giving more people in our country the chance to live out the American dream is why all of you are here today. You know, equality never happens by accident. It's something we have to work for, we need to foster it, and we need to defend in the hearts of Americans. And that work continues with all of you. The President signed our education bill into law today, but that is not the end of the work to help all kids get an equal opportunity at a good education. We have to continue to hold our schools and our districts and our states accountable for educating each and every child and advocate for equality. We have to continue looking at the resources our students have access to and press for changes that will help them graduate ready to create and take on the jobs of the 21st century. And we have to continue to take a hard look at ourselves, at our education and our justice systems, at our government, at our society, and together we will not rest until the door of opportunity is open to all Americans. We've taken a good step forward today with the law that was passed and signed in on education. And with your continued focus on quality education, it won't be the last step that we take together. So thank you very much. It's great to be here with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Murray. She has so graciously agreed to answer a few questions, and I will maybe kick us off by saying, you know, you referenced holding states accountable, holding schools and districts accountable. This is just the first step, but we need to be vigilant. Do you have any advice for the Chamber and the NAACP as we're trying to come together in this Business Civil Rights Coalition to really hold states accountable?
That is a really important question, because one of the reasons that everyone agreed that No Child Left Behind law was broken was it was a one-size-fits-all federal mandate to meet these requirements, and what happens if you did not. My home state of Washington was on the receiving end of this. Virtually every parent in our state got a letter from their school at the beginning of this year saying that their school was failing. I'm going to tell you that didn't improve the education of any child. It just fit the mandate of the federal law. So what we have done with the law that we just passed is we tell the states they need to meet these requirements, but we do not tell them how to meet them. We are putting that on their shoulders and telling them that they now need to come up with evidence-based solutions to make sure that kids are meeting the requirements that we all agree they need to meet in order to get a certificate that says they graduated that actually means something. So we've put this requirement on local states and local districts to determine evidence-based ways to make sure their kids are meeting the requirements that we know they have to have a good education. So passing a law is never the end of the day, and I always remind that people here, we have a responsibility as legislators to make sure the law is implemented across the country as we intended it to. And to this, we are going to be turning to local community leaders and school districts and states to work with us to make sure that this law works as intended, and it is going to be incumbent upon all of us to hold them accountable to that.
Thank you. Questions? Questions for Senator Murray? Raise your hand and we'll have a mic to you quickly. Oh, come on. You have such a great opportunity here.
Hi, Senator Murray. So how do you make sure that what happens in Washington State and then what happens in my state of Texas, there is some kind of floor so that the standard is not reduced, and so it's not substandard in Washington State and skewed in Texas?
And that's an excellent question, and it is a responsibility of all of us to make sure that that does occur. But under the current law, or now I can say under the law that we had yesterday, that was already happening, where schools had different assessments and different requirements and held their students to different standards. So I think some of the most important provisions in here are that the information that schools have that I just outlined has to be transparent and public and given to parents and teachers and communities. So there is a light on them, a very bright shining light. And if we know that schools are not meeting that and the legislatures are saying we don't care, there will be a focus on that. That's the intent of this law.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sharif El-Meki from Philadelphia. After finishing my Principal Ambassador Fellowship under Secretary Duncan, I started an organization with some other people from Philadelphia to basically increase the number of black male educators in the region in Philadelphia, Camden. I was curious about there was conversation earlier about the law hopefully addressing diversity in the teaching force. Can you speak to that? If it made it in, or some of the
in terms of
conversation?
educators themselves?
Yes.
Yeah, so that I think addresses a real critical issue in this country, because role models are essential in every walk of life. And certainly in our classrooms, if kids identify with their teachers, they have a better chance of success. So we don't have provisions within the education law itself, but I certainly think it's something that all of us involved in education need to really discuss. How do we make that happen? How do we make sure that potential teachers, minority teachers in particular, go to college and become a teacher? What are the incentives there? We actually have a workforce that we are very worried about in terms of education across the country. A number of retiring teachers, teachers who are leaving, a lack of teachers coming into the field. How do we recruit, retain, and get good quality teachers that are diverse across the country is a major question, and one that is complex, including our higher ed reauthorization bill, to our universities themselves, to our local communities, to those of us who are out in the public eye, talking to young kids and encouraging them to be teachers today. The saddest thing I hear is teachers themselves who in front of a classroom tell their kids, don't ever be a teacher. And we just have to turn that around, and it's incumbent upon all of us.
One more, I think the senator has time for one more question. So, Carrie.
Yeah, my name is Mike Alston with Qualcomm. Tagging on what you just said, the lack of teachers, let's talk specifically about computer science. That's the one field that 9 out of 10 schools in the United States don't teach computer science. It's so crucial to so many aspects of society today, technology. How are we going to solve that gap? I think the primary reason is anyone who's good at computer science can make a lot more money in industry than teaching. That's a fundamental reason why we have such a lack of qualified computer science teachers. So we're getting most of our engineers from overseas, from China, from India, from other countries. How do we solve this?
Okay, you're talking about the STEM classes in general. And
actually, computer science specifically.
Singly, well, I come from a state that's very high-tech oriented, and you're right, they need to know some programming, but that can be taught if you have the right math skills and science skills and the interest to begin with. And what I hear from many businesses in our state, the emphasis on math, science, and STEM programs are really what creates the culture. And on a side note, we have to get young girls to want to take these classes and to get them interested in doing this, and make it okay for an 8th grade girl to be really good in math and science and computer science. But we also have to make sure our schools are offering it. And I think that's going to take public-private partnerships. That's what it's done in my state, where many of the businesses who need kids in these areas taking these classes have worked with our schools, doing both tutoring and providing equipment and supplies. But a lot of times, one of the most successful things I've seen is a lot of our businesses, and I will speak to all the business leaders here, who send over tutors to our elementary schools. So you're sitting next to a Microsoft engineer and you're a 3rd grader, and she is telling you, look, here's how you do this, and you can get a job like me if you do this. So it's a really good question, and one we need to address from a very wide range. Yeah, thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
Okay, now you've gotten through almost the whole day, and we're off to the fun part. So Congressman Scott, who was delayed slightly due to some votes, is going to join us probably in about 15 minutes or so. So we'll all be over there enjoying your first glass of wine when he comes, and he'll be able to join us there at the reception and say a few remarks. I just have a couple of things, more housekeeping for you. I think it was referenced earlier that Terrence Roberts, a gift to everyone is his wonderful book, and he has signed many copies, and I think it's still in there signing. So please grab one of those off the bookshelves. And one note for you about tomorrow morning: we do not have this venue tomorrow morning, the briefing center. We will be in the Hall of Flags, but the entrance for the event tomorrow will be that back door. So when you come in, you'll be directed to that door to get in. And breakfast at 8 a.m. We start promptly at 8:30. Quickly, I want to just say, we talked a lot about having chapter leaders and chamber leaders here together. We have 40 plus states represented in the room, but I'm just going to tick off really quickly the states that are represented here that have both chamber and chapter leaders together. And it's been hard, I know, because we've had such a packed agenda for you all to really interact and meet one another. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity at the reception, and you'll have some time tomorrow to really interact. But I just want to flag for you those states, so you'll know you have a counterpart here in the room, and that's Alabama, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, Washington State, and Wisconsin. So hopefully there'll be some opportunity for you to meet those colleagues and hopefully potential partners. So thank you all so much for sticking with us today, and please come enjoy yourself for a few moments. Thanks.